Hello, my dear subscribers. I've prepared part 2 of recap that you so requested. I will be glad if you like and subscribe to the channel. I wish you a pleasant viewing. Our heroes, led by Zik Moore, were absolutely ready for the upcoming battle and were just waiting for Besnol Shalom to give the order to his subordinates. The protagonist understood the inevitability of this and therefore advised his students to fight side by side and cover each other. Unexpectedly, Besnol Shalom admitted with displeasure that Zik Moore was quite smart for an impudent boy. Still, the old man loudly ordered his subordinates to kill our heroes, after which several armed men immediately rushed to attack. Sloka and Hans took on this fight fearlessly and even had success, as they were able to seriously injure their opponents. Zik Moore also kept up with his students and even surpassed them, which was natural. The guy easily dealt with several opponents at the same time. Suddenly, one of Besnol Shalom's subordinates swung his weapon sharply, intending to carry out the old man's order. This guy was very young but had a sickly appearance. Zik Moore easily dodged this attack, while thinking that this guy was a local resident who was probably forced to be here like the others. Also, the main character, noticing the appearance of his opponents, thought that they were all probably infected. Zik Moore was very unhappy that Besnol Shalom was hiding behind the backs of ordinary people who didn't even know how to fight. The main character believed that this vile old man behaved exactly like a fest. Suddenly, Zik Moore turned to his subordinates. Slock and Hans looked at their teacher in surprise, not even guessing what he was about to tell them. The protagonist said that their opponents did not look like assassins in black hoods and were more like ordinary people, so they should all be left alive. Sloka was surprised by this order because he did not expect that the teacher would care about the well-being of those who wished them death. Meanwhile, Hans had already begun to carry out Zik Moore's order and grabbed one of Slock's opponents. Slock was surprised again. Hans turned to the main character with a satisfied look and, showing him the captured enemy, asked if he understood him correctly. Zik Moore advised sending him into an unconscious state. Sloka, watching this, finally realized that Hans was following in the footsteps of the main character. Zik Moore continued to fight, thinking along the way that his opponents were ordinary civilians who were forced to do this, so it was impossible to kill them. However, our heroes did not have time to deal with them in a good way, so only brute force was used. The next moment, Zik Moore, without using his weapon, attacked one of the opponents with all his might, after which he would certainly no longer be able to continue the fight. Then the main character continued to think that Besnol Shalom was about to understand that his plans were not destined to come true, which meant that it was time for the old man to reveal his cards. Indeed, Besnol Shalom watched with fear in his eyes as all of his subordinates fell to the ground, one by one, at the hands of our heroes, which could not help but frighten him. The fear that had taken hold of the old man suddenly gave way to anger over the failure, so he needed to act more decisively. Finally, an angry Besnol Shalom spoke loudly to someone named Krobit and ordered him to come here. At that very moment, someone's loud footsteps were heard, echoing throughout the room. A huge humanoid monster entered the room and looked around with its furious eyes, trying to find its target. Sloka and Hans were so shocked and happy at what they saw that they were speechless. They didn't understand what kind of creature it was. Meanwhile, the monster was not going to just stand and wait and was already ready to attack, simultaneously emitting a furious roar. Zik Moore was not impressed by this because he was thinking that, although he had never seen Fest, he remembered this monster who was one of his subordinates. This finally confirmed the fact that Besnol Shalom was at least somehow connected with Fest. Along with this, Slock desperately tried to warn the protagonist. The guy said loudly that Krobit was approaching them. Zik Moore saw it perfectly well, but he was too lazy to fight this monster. At this time, everything outside was quiet and calm. The approaching night did not allow anyone to disturb this idyll, frightening everyone who wanted to do so with its sinisterness. However, someone still decided to disturb this peace. Suddenly, the large entrance door that led into the mansion was destroyed by a strong blow. This was the result of the battle between the protagonist and Krobit. The guy had to accept this fight despite his reluctance to do so. Even though Zik Moore was quite confident in his skills, the monster's brute force still had a significant impact, so the guy had a hard time. The main character was very unhappy with the current situation because his attacks on the monster felt like he was hitting a rock, because Krobit's code was quite strong. Besnol Shalom saw that it was not as easy for the boy to fight against the monster as against people, so the old man made fun of him, being confident in his victory. However, Zik Moore did not even think of giving up and continued to attack the monster, hoping to wait until he made a mistake. However, Krobit had his own opinion on this. He not only fought off the guy's attacks, but also tried to hit him back. During another attack, the monster swung his battle axe so hard to attack Zeke more that the blast wave from the impact with the floor spread in all directions. The main character was able to jump back in time, but realized that this was an excellent moment for a counterattack, so he pushed off the ground hard and rushed back into battle. It was a good moment to strike. Zeke Moore was in an advantageous position for himself, and Krobit still had not pulled his stuck axe out of the ground. The next moment, the protagonist attacked the monster directly in his hand, but it did not give any result because his skin was very strong. After this, Zeke Moore quickly turned his gaze to the side in order to see what was happening around him. The protagonist saw Sloka and Hans, who continued to fight the remaining opponents who seemed to have no end. Zeke Moore realized that they were in a very bad position, which meant he would probably have to work hard to win. The guy thought that he had more mana than he had in the mines, but it was still not enough to finish off the monster with one blow. In this case, the protagonist decided to use the sense expansion skill to make up for the lack of mana by using mana resonance. After this weapon, the guy began to be enveloped in a bright aura, which indicated that Zeke Moore was already ready to fulfill his plans. However, the main character was in no hurry to attack and continued to dodge the monster's blows, because now the most important thing for him was to wait for the right moment. During another attack, Zeke Moore managed to swing his sword before Krobit brought down his battle axe. At that very moment, a sharp pain pierced the monster, and a stream of blood gushed from his newly formed small wound. Because of this, Krobit hesitated for a moment and did not attack Zeke Moore as he had planned before. The main character noticed this uncertainty and realized that right now was the very moment he had been waiting for. The next moment, the guy took his sword deep into the monster's chest, which finally discouraged him. Scarlet blood splashed in all directions. Krobit suddenly began to cough up blood and his eyes turned white with intense pain, indicating the seriousness of the injury he had received. At the same time, Zeke Moore was closely watching his opponent. The guy was not going to stop there. The next moment, he used his mana to use the skill Raging Hurricane, which came straight from his sword and passed through Krobit's body. Besnal Shalom, who saw all this, was shocked by what was happening and did not understand who the main character was and where he could have such skills. Suddenly, not far from you, the old man heard someone screaming, which frightened him even more and made him look around with horror in his eyes. The elderly man saw that the very hurricane that Zeke Moore had caused had spread throughout the entire room, and having swallowed up several of his subordinates, was already approaching him. Besnal Shalom immediately began to run away as far as possible in order not to become another victim of this element. It turned out that the target of this hurricane was not the old man, but Krobit, who still had not recovered from such a blow to the main character. The monster sensed the approach of great danger, but he was no longer able to do anything about it. The next moment, the creature's body was torn to pieces by powerful streams of air. Blood and pieces of meat that the wind had carried all over the room soon began to fall on the floor, frightening Besnal Shalom even more, because for him, this was definitely the end. Soon everything was over and quiet. Zeke Moore looked around and assessed the consequences of his attack, and was a little dissatisfied thinking that it was still not as powerful as before. After that, the guy hid his sword in its sheath and, coming closer and closer to Besnal Shalom, asked if the old man was the one who was behind the spread of all this infection. The old man was very angry about his loss and therefore was not going to simply answer the protagonist's questions. Zeke Moore continued to say that he saw what kind of weapons the assassins hired by the old man used. These were the same knives that the guys who tried to drag Sloka to Seoul used. That is why the guy assumed that the old man worked with those people in black cloaks. But he did not understand why Besnal Shalom said that he was not obliged to explain anything and did everything to restore justice. The main character was very surprised by these words and did not understand what justice had to do with it. Besnal Shalom began to shout loudly with discontent that he could have destroyed the Dracula family if he had a little more time, but the guy ruined his plans. The old man continued to shout that he should have finished off Zeke Moore first. Hans and Slock watched in amazement, not even guessing what would happen next. Suddenly, the old man took a small bottle out of his pocket, and I assumed that he should have just kept the main character here. He then considered that, in this case, his plans for the Dracula legacy would come true. After this, the old man threw the bottle on the floor, causing it to shatter into pieces. Some kind of purple liquid immediately spilled across the floor, and thick smoke spread throughout the room. Slock and Hans immediately began to cover their noses and mouths, fearing that this smoke could be dangerous and poisonous. However, Zeke Moore calmed them down and said that it was just a regular smoke bomb that was nothing to be afraid of. After that, Hans asked if they would go in pursuit of Besnal Shalom. The main character briefly confirmed this, but he still did not fully understand how best to proceed. However, Zeke Moore decided not to think about it for long and declared that they would simply break into the castle. At this late hour, the light was still burning in the gloomy dungeon, but its occupant was not yet asleep. A guy in obviously expensive clothes was sitting on the dirty floor, his hands and feet chained. It seemed that this place was not at all suitable for someone like him. This guy was Joachim Drakel, who, judging by the expression on his face, did not understand at all why they did this to him and why he was here. Entering the street, Zeke Moore informed his students that they were to go to the castle of Slock immediately, and Hans complied with this without objection. Then the main character thought about Joachim Dracula and assumed that he was probably having a hard time right now. Suddenly, the guy interrupted these thoughts because his attention was strongly attracted by something on the ground. For some reason, Zeke Moore was looking closely at the corpse of one of the locals who had obeyed Besnol Shalom's order and attacked him. It turned out that the main character's attention was drawn to a small drop of blood that was shining brightly behind the deceased's ear. At this time, there was a rotting silence in the castle dungeon, because there was only one prisoner here who did not even think of making noise. Joachim Dracul was still sitting on the floor and thinking how his brother Guillaume Dracul dared to lock him here. The guy also wondered how he managed to gain control over the family castle. Besides this, Joachim Dracul thought about how pathetic he was because he promised to return Miss Bargo, but instead, he ended up in captivity. The guy hoped that everything was fine with her. Suddenly, someone quietly entered the dungeon and, addressing the prisoner, suggested that the guy's affairs were not going well at all. To this, Joachim Dracul rudely asked how the stranger dared to enter a place where only incorrigible sinners were spent. The stranger did not respond to this, and approaching the required cell, only admired the guy and his stern gaze. The young man in the hood began to say with great enthusiasm that there was still life in Joachim Dracula's eyes. The guy didn't want to listen to this and asked the stranger to get closer to the point. The stranger explained that he had come here to help the boy, after which he handed him an amazing magical item called a blood vessel. The hooded guy then asked the prisoner to place this magical object into his body. He assured that after this, Joachim Dracula would be able to gain great power, which could not help but surprise the guy. The stranger, with a smile on his face, continued to say that the guy would be able to overthrow his brother who caused him death, as well as all those who followed him. Suddenly, Joachim Dracul categorically refused this offer, which completely discouraged the man in the hood who clearly did not expect such an answer. Joachim Dracul explained that he did not know the guy at all and was not so stupid as to absorb something offered to him by a stranger without question. These words did not please the unknown man in the hood, as evidenced by his clenched fist. The stranger looked at the prisoner and thought that according to the plan, having become angry with Guillaume Dracul, the guy had to accept the bloody vessel without a single doubt. He assumed that all this was because of the scoundrel who invented a cure for the game's disease. As a result, Joachim Dracula's hatred for his older brother weakened. Then the stranger said that she would tell the guy the whole truth and began to assure him that a person who was able to control infectious diseases at will was involved in this. Then the man in the hood asked if the guy didn't find it strange that various kinds of illnesses suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Joachim Dracula was really alarmed by these words. After this, the unknown person stated that all these illnesses were the merit of that very person, who moreover conspired with the boy's older brother. The stranger continued to say that all this was done solely for the sake of reprisal against Joachim Dracula. His older brother sent diseases to all the nearby settlements simply so that he would die. Of course, in Osperen, Guillaume Dracul spread the weakest of diseases because he himself lived in this city together with his minions. The stranger continued to say that this was why Joachim Dracula was imprisoned. They had no other choice because the guy still wouldn't die. After what was said, the man in the hood again offered to take his blow. Joachim Dracula was amazed by all this and asked if the stranger was not on his brother's side. He admitted that he really did help Guillaume Dracula because he needed him temporarily. He then stated that if Guillaume Dracul became count, then Osperen and the whole world would in a matter of minutes turn into a real hell on earth. These words frightened Joachim Dracul. After this, the stranger asked if Joachim Dracul was really going to give up the chance to save the world because of some stranger. This really made the guy think. The man in the hood saw doubt in the boy's eyes and again handed him the magical item, hoping that this time he would accept it. The unknown asked Joachim Dracula to absorb this bloody vessel if he wanted to protect what was dear to him. It seemed that the guy was really going to do it. Suddenly a man appeared in the dungeon who, having heard everything from the very beginning, said that it all really sounded wonderful. The stranger became alarmed. Zeke Moore continued to walk forward without any hesitation, asking along the way if the stranger could give him the opportunity to buy this magical item from him. Joachim Dracul was very surprised when he saw his friend here. At the same time, the stranger was unhappy with all this and began to quickly hide the bloody vessel. Zeke Moore continued to say that he was curious about the object that the hooded man was hiding in his sleeve, so the guy asked him to tell him about it, to which he refused. This only amused the main character, who continued to say that the assassins should have been more understanding of the one they had attacked so many times. The stranger remained just as serious and wary. He continued to insist that Zeke Moore had no need to know about all this. After this, silence reigned in the dungeon. Each of those present thought about what had happened and tried to understand what would happen next. Suddenly, Zeke Moore said that it was not fun at all to have a conversation with a stranger, and that his colleagues with whom the guy had already had to communicate were not so boring. The man in the hood was very surprised by this. The main character continued to say that he had one theory after meeting one of the assassins back then in Seoul. The guy believed that these assassins were an organization that created demonic people. After these words, Joachim Dracul noticed that the stranger tensed up. Zeke Moore then suggested that the hooded stranger was just about to make such a demonic man out of Joachim by feeding him this bloody vessel. The stranger showed with his whole appearance that the main character was absolutely right in his judgments, so it could already be considered that this plan had failed. He was angry and thought that he now had no choice but to hold out until reinforcements arrived here. At this time, Zeke Moore looked at the stranger and thought that he really was not going to talk to him, and therefore it would not be easy to get anything out of him. Suddenly, loud footsteps and conversations were heard in the corridor, which immediately attracted the attention of the main character and the hooded assassin. The stranger was very pleased because he believed that these sounds were a harbinger of the fact that his comrades had already arrived to help him. At the same time, Joachim Dracul began to get nervous because he was afraid that reinforcements had arrived from his older brother Biom. Finally, someone entered the dungeon, and now everything became clear. It turned out that it was Hans and Sloka, along with the knights who obeyed Joachim Dracula. The guy loudly informed his master that they had captured this castle. Joachim Dracul was shocked by this news, but at the same time he sighed with relief. The same could not be said about the hooded assassin, who was not at all pleased by this news. Zeke Moore noticed this and asked what was wrong with the guy's face, after which he assumed that he was going to stall for time, but he failed. Then the main character smiled slyly and asked the stranger how it felt to experience this feeling. The guy kept asking if the brief presence of hope was a pleasant feeling. Without answering, the stranger suddenly jumped up from his place in order to try to escape from our heroes, while simultaneously being indignant that his plans had been thwarted. Zeke Moore, seeing this, immediately turned to Slock, letting him know that he expected something from him. The young guy understood everything without further explanation and used his power, causing his body to be enveloped in a mysterious aura. At that very moment, an earthquake began in the dungeon, causing the ceiling to gradually collapse and large stones to fall down directly onto the assassin. The stranger, seeing this, began to get very nervous because he already understood that he would not be able to escape from this. The next moment, there was a faltering roar, as if from a powerful explosion. Our heroes stood quietly to the side and watched as the dungeon collapsed, burying that very unknown person under its rubble. Suddenly, the main character realized that everything was not as smooth as he would have liked. Joachim's subordinate Dracula was also very worried about something. It turned out that the man was very worried about the fact that his master was also buried under stones, because he was not far from the assassin and was now not visible. Suddenly, the ground under our hero's feet began to shake again, and the dust that had not yet settled on the floor rose into the air again. Very soon, a huge stone hand appeared from under the rubble, as if holding something in its fist. Joachim Dracula's subordinate was amazed by what he saw in front of him and did not understand at all what was happening. Soon the huge stone hand unclenched its fist, and it turned out that inside was a living and unharmed Joachim Dracul. Zeke Moore himself was surprised by this outcome, so he praised Sloka for his excellent work. Meanwhile, the subordinate turned to his master and asked if he was okay. Joachim Dracul was of course shocked by what happened, but was not injured. Hearing this, the main character decided that they should not waste time and suggested going upstairs. Joachim Dracul agreed, because he wanted to deal with his older brother as soon as possible. Zeke Moore was surprised by this and asked if the guy really thought that Biom Dracul was to blame for everything. Very soon our heroes were walking in complete silence along the long corridors of the castle, which were illuminated only by the moonlight coming through the large windows. At the same time, Zeke Moore looked at Joachim Dracula because it was obvious that something was bothering him. The recent events had a strong impact on the guy, so now he was extremely silent and thoughtful. The protagonist thought about how Joachim Dracula interacted with his subordinates now, and thought that it was extremely unlike the guy he knew in his past life. Joachim could have inherited the reins of power long ago if it weren't for his sickly constitution, so the boy didn't resist the rise of his older brother. Sometime later, our heroes arrived at the right place. Joachim Dracula suddenly opened the doors to see the one who was behind all the atrocities. In the semi-dark room, there was only Besnal Shalom, who seemed to be waiting for the appearance of our heroes. Joachim Dracula was very surprised to see an elderly man here, because he could not have expected that he was behind everything. Besides everything else, the old man was standing next to someone's body. Joachim Dracula immediately assumed that it was his older brother. Seeing our heroes, Besnal Shalom, with a sly smile on his face, assumed that the person he trusted apparently failed to complete his task since they were all here. Then the old man looked at the main character and was surprised that he managed to survive and save Joachim once again. Joachim Dracula was angry and asked if Besnal Shalom was the one behind everything that was happening. The guy also asked if the old man was the one who spread all those diseases. Besnal Shalom was amused by the fact that the guy only now understood everything. The next moment, unable to contain his satisfied smile, the elderly man confirmed that it was he who had done all this. In addition, the old man said that he was also the one who brought Father Joachim Dracula to such a state. Suddenly, Besnal Shalom began to laugh loudly while saying that he did all this in order to bring the Dracula family to justice. Joachim Dracula was shocked by this statement because he did not understand what kind of justice the old man was talking about. The angry guy was also interested in what happened to Miss Bargo and where she was. Suddenly, Zeke Moore said that Joachim Dracula was wrong. This surprised the guy because he did not understand what the main character meant when he said these words. Zeke Moore briefly explained that Besnal Shalom was just a puppet. The guy also said that the real culprit of what happened was Fest. At that very moment, the room was filled with the ringing sound of heels. Someone was approaching. This sound immediately attracted the attention of our heroes, so everyone except Zeke Moore turned around to look at the unexpected guest. Soon a voice familiar to everyone present said that Besnal Shalom was indeed right. It turned out that it was Miss Bargo, who did not hide her surprise that Zeke Moore was still alive. Shocked by the latest events, Joachim Dracula turned to Zeke Moore and asked if the one he named could be the real criminal. The main character nodded his head slightly and briefly confirmed the guy's guess. He continued to say that it was Miss Bargo who spread the epidemic among people in several settlements at once. The girl did not deny this at all, and only smiled. Zeke Moore also said that on top of that, Besnal Shalom was the one who helped Miss Bargo commit her atrocities. The old man was angry because of these words. Joachim Dracula could not believe what he heard, and asked if the old man really decided to thank his father for his kindness in this way. Suddenly enraged, Besnal Shalom drew his sword and demanded that the boy shut up. The old man was very angry, and he clearly had something to tell Joachim about his father. He then asked the boy if he knew what his father had done to gain the status of landowner. Joachim Dracula was shocked and had no idea what story he was about to hear. Trying to contain his emotions, Besnal Shalom began to tell that this happened more than 10 years ago. When the epidemic hit Osperen, the boy's father turned everything upside down in search of all sorts of methods to stop the spread of the disease. To some extent, this did indeed bear fruit, but it was not that simple. It didn't take long before all of the man's methods resulted in huge debts. Because of this, Joachim Dracula's father found himself under serious financial pressure. Besnal Shalom continued to tell that secretly the epidemic spread again, but only where the man was in debt. Joachim Dracula was shocked by what he heard and could not believe that his father had actually done such a thing. Besnal Shalom also said that the huge sums of money that people had lent out of trust in the Count disappeared in the chaos of the disease. The old man was very angry because his friend, who was previously the sole owner of the Bargo company, fell victim to that very epidemic. That is why Besnal Shalom decided to hold a trial against the Dracula family and was going to execute another of its representatives together with Miss Bargo. Suddenly, this speech was interrupted by Zeke Moore, who said that it was just funny. The elderly man clearly did not like these words. The guy continued to say that if the old man wanted revenge, then it was his right. But in that case, there was no point in him killing other residents who had not committed any crime. Then the main character recalled the words of Besnal Shalom, who recently said that his trial should have been only over the Dracula family. The old man tried to justify himself by saying that those people were stupid and praised the Count. Zick Moore did not let the old man finish speaking and said that he behaved exactly like the Count, whom he wanted to take revenge on. The detailed comparison angered Besnal Shalom even more. Still, the old man bowed his head to think about these words and make a final decision. The old man clutched his sword tightly in his hand and seemed to have no intention of retreating from the chosen path. Still, Besnal Shalom raised his sword endowed with energy, while saying that Zeke Moore and everyone else knew nothing, but were talking nonsense. The absolutely calm protagonist understood what would happen next, and therefore advised Joachim Dracula to step back to protect himself. The next moment, consumed by rage, Besnal Shalom rushed to attack our heroes, intending to carry out his revenge right then and there. Joachim Dracula was shocked by what was happening, and immediately looked at your comrade to make sure he was safe. Zeke Moore had already drawn his sword and was waiting for his opponent to approach in order to fight him. Suddenly a stream of scarlet blood gushed out, indicating that one of the participants in the battle had already been wounded. Blood splashes also landed on the face of the main character, who was shocked by what had happened. Besnal Shalom was badly wounded in the back and could barely stand on his feet, and behind him a dark figure stood and watched. The elderly man tried his best to stay conscious in order to find out why this happened. Miss Bargo, who was standing behind the old man, assumed that there had been a big mistake somewhere. The girl was also covered in blood, but she smiled and said that she did not want revenge, unlike Besnal Shalom. She explained that she just wanted more people to catch the disease, and that was it. Hans and Slock were shocked by what was happening and did not understand how all this could happen. Zeke Moore asked what was the reason for the actions taken if the girl did not want revenge. Miss Bargo decided to share this information with the guy, but before that, she finally dealt with Besnal Shalom. The old man's body fell dead to the floor. She then mysteriously said that she found a very compelling reason just at the moment when her family fell ill. It happened unexpectedly. Her husband and child, who were perfectly fine just the day before, came down with a high fever and started coughing up blood. Perhaps because of how contagious the disease was, even doctors did not dare to approach them. Miss Bargo could have gotten sick too, but she overcame her fear. The woman nursed her husband and child because she loved them very much. She had seen similar suffering hundreds and thousands of times. She looked closely at the faces of sick people who were becoming paler and more lifeless. It was at one of these moments that an idea came to Miss Bargo. She suddenly realized how beautiful the faces of those who died from illness were. The girl was truly grateful that Count Dracula allowed her to become acquainted with this kind of beauty. Suddenly, this story was interrupted by Joachim Dracula's subordinate, who was very angry because he could no longer listen to all this. The man prepared his sword and asked his master to give him the correct order. He believed that this woman had to be taken into custody because she was a mad woman for whom the death of their fellow men was just some kind of entertainment. At this, Miss Bargo smiled slyly, since she clearly had no intention of submitting to such a decision. She began to doubt that our heroes would be able to capture her and take her into custody. The woman then asked if those present really thought that she had come there just like that without any particular reason. Joachim Dracula was very angry with her and asked what kind of game she had planned this time. Miss Bargot asked whether it was true that people in Osperen had contracted the game disease as was known. Joachim Dracul immediately assumed that the woman was threatening to take people hostage. Miss Bargo smiled sincerely and was surprised, because she assumed that the guy was one of those people who thought quickly. Hearing this, Joachim Dracul became very tense but still found the strength to ask who these hostages were. Suddenly, Miss Bargo began to smile widely, a mad smile, as she could no longer contain her emotions. The next moment, she declared that absolutely all the inhabitants of Hans and Slock were her hostages, and they also could not believe in the reality of what they had just heard with their own ears. Joachim Dracul did not believe until the very end that such a large number of people could become ill. Then Miss Bargo reminded her that her specialty was infectious diseases. This reminder was enough to convince Joachim Dracula that he was now fully aware of the seriousness of the situation. Then Miss Bargo suggested starting the conversation again, but the main character suddenly stopped her. Zeke Moore felt that enough had been said within these walls, so there was no point in continuing. Instead of words, he chose to use his sword. The woman was sorry to hear this, and besides, she didn't expect the guy to behave so childishly. She also suggested that the main character simply still could not believe her words and the seriousness of her intentions. Zeke Moore confirmed this and added that he only trusted the words of the previous owner of Bargo. Then the woman assumed that in this way the guy trusted her to sacrifice all the inhabitants of Osperen. To this, the main character said that even if he had to choose between two options, and even if he decided to sacrifice the inhabitants, the woman would die anyway. Hans did not agree with this decision at all, and reminded his master that he himself had previously said that it was necessary to live peacefully. Zeke Moore confirmed this, because he did not intend to go back on his words, but he still intended to kill this woman. Hans was still unhappy and asked if the guy didn't understand that in that case, the inhabitants of Osperen would simply die from the disease. Suddenly, Zeke Moore declared that it was an inevitable sacrifice. These words struck Hans so much that he was immediately speechless. The main character understood that perhaps the guy thought his words were cruel because he dreamed of being a real hero straight from a fairy tale. But in reality, people still had to make a choice sometime. Zeke Moore continued to say that sometimes there were moments like now when a terrible choice stood right before your eyes. So to become a hero, you had to be able to make a decision, even if you had to put up with pain. Now the choice was whether they should let this woman escape and then lock themselves forever in some remote mountain, or agree with her and start an epidemic, spreading it everywhere. Then Zeke Moore asked whether those people who would die from the epidemic outside the city would be any worse for them than the inhabitants of Osperen itself. Hans didn't answer this question because he himself already understood that they had no other choice. Zeke Moore also added that he did say that it was necessary to live in a good way, but he did not say that it was necessary to live in such a way that when comparing, one would choose a better option. Listen to this entire monologue from beginning to end. Miss Bargo asked what the main character had already decided to do in the end. The woman assumed that they would finish everything now. These words sounded absolutely cold, as if she was not at all afraid of what would happen next. At the same time, the main character seemed to be pleased and drew attention to the fact that he had already voiced his decision regarding this situation a long time ago. Suddenly, Joachim Drakel turned to the boy and took him by the hand in order to keep him from making hasty decisions. The guy insisted that the main character was wrong and they couldn't just sacrifice all the inhabitants. Zeke Moore asked his comrade not to worry because the inhabitants of Osperen were safe. Joachim Drakel breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this and was glad that the guy's words were just a bluff. Suddenly, the main character declared that his words were the pure truth. This greatly surprised and again alarmed Joachim Dracula. Zeke Moore continued to say that when choosing between Miss Bargo and the people of Osperen, one had to really think about which of them should be abandoned. Joachim Drakel did not understand what the guy meant. The main character explained that the woman's condition would not work initially, because at that moment, the treatment of all the patients had already been completed. Miss Bargo, hearing this, immediately became alarmed, which was evident from her changed expression, and began to think about how this was even possible. Zeke Moore noticed this and asked with great pleasure how the woman felt at that moment, because her small hope was so sweet. Miss Bargo could not believe that all the sick residents of the city of Osperen were already healthy, and believed that Zeke Moore was simply lying to her. The woman was angry about this and did not understand how this was even possible. The main character said that if a person fell ill with the disease that the woman created, then he would develop redness behind the ears, which was a symptom of a disease called galderum. Then the main character began to remember that after Besnal Shalom escaped, he went outside to head to the castle, but something caught his attention. At first, the guy saw the manifestation of this disease on the body of a resident of a village neighboring Osperen, which Miss Bargo had already managed to take under her control at that time. On the way to the county, the suspicions that Zeke Moore had after this were only confirmed. The guy was in such a hurry to get to the castle that he accidentally ran into a passerby. The man immediately fell to the ground because in addition to the collision, it turned out he was also weakened by illness. The main character's attention was immediately drawn to what he had already seen in the village nearby. He saw that the inhabitants of Osperen also had similar marks behind their ears. So the guy immediately started treating the sick and finished everything before he even came here. After hearing all this, Miss Bargo still did not believe the guy and thought that even if he had found out about the disease, he still would not have been able to get treatment. The woman explained that the medicine for galderum included the insides of desert ginseng, which was an incredibly rare component and could not be obtained to treat all patients. Zeke Moore was very surprised when he learned about the insides of ginseng because he didn't even know what it was. For treatment, the guy took holcomb. Miss Bargo didn't know what kind of plant it was, and then Zeke Moore told her that there was a purple grass that grew all over the roads. In simple terms, it was a weed, so supply and demand for it as an ingredient was not a problem at all, and creating a medicine from it was easier. Miss Bargo demanded that the guy stop deceiving her because she could not believe that the disease she created could be cured with some grass from the side of the road. Zeke Moore decided to play a joke on the woman and asked if this was not the peak of her abilities, after which he thought that, in fact, the herb hulcum had a wonderful effect during the bubonic plague. Miss Bargo was very upset by such comments, but she was not going to back down from her chosen path. However, the woman admitted that the main character really could have created this medicine. However, she was interested in how the guy managed to spread it throughout the entire city of Osporin in just one day, and do it so secretly that no one in the county noticed. Suddenly, Zeke Moore said that it was the woman who told him how this could be done. Miss Bargo was very surprised by this because she did not understand what the guy was talking about. Then the main character explained that if the medicine was in liquid form, it would have almost no taste. After this, the shocked woman immediately remembered how she told the guy that the disease was mainly spread through water sources. The next moment, Zeke Moore, with a satisfied grin on his face, announced that he had simply added medicine to the well. The woman gave the guy information about how the epidemic was spreading, and the main character simply used this information to create a cure. Just before leaving for the county, the guy checked that those who drank the mixture really did have the red spot behind their ear disappear. Therefore, he assumed that by now all the patients had probably already come for treatment. Special assistance in this matter was provided by the soldiers who obeyed Joachim Dracula. Also, Zeke Moore was sure that the infected inhabitants of Osporin, without exception, had recovered from this disease. Now the main character had enough reason to kill the woman and absolutely no restrictions not to do it, which made him very happy. Miss Bargo was depressed and didn't think the guy would actually go that far. Zeke Moore noted that this was usually what people who were hostile to him said. After this, the woman, considering that she had no other choice, took out from her deep sleeve a small bottle with a bright glowing liquid. Miss Bargo looked at the main character with a crazy look and squeezed the bottle hard, crushing it, while saying that she didn't want to use it. But now it didn't matter. A strange liquid immediately began to flow down the woman's hand and gradually be absorbed directly into her skin. Zeke Moore was very surprised by this outcome and did not understand what would happen next and how this liquid would affect Miss Bargo. Very soon, something strange began to happen. The woman's body was enveloped in a mysterious, ominous aura that forced her to transform. It looked as if strong currents of wind were gradually blowing away Miss Bargo, freeing her new form from her human body. The woman really regretted it because she didn't want to show herself so ugly to those present. Hans and Sloka watched what was happening with fear in their eyes and already understood where it was all heading. The next moment, the woman appeared before our heroes in a completely new appearance. It was the image of a real witch. Besides all this, Miss Bargo was surrounded by a willful aura that looked very dangerous and only brought problems. Joachim Drakel immediately ordered his subordinates to immediately tie up the woman. Several knights rushed forward without question to carry out the order. The witch was not going to give up without a fight, so she used one of her skills to attack the people in response with her elongated, transformed arm. The knights immediately began to dodge and try to hit this hand, not noticing how splashes of purple liquid flew around along the way. As soon as this liquid came into contact with the skin of one of the knights, he immediately felt an unpleasant sensation. After that, the man fell to his knees and grabbed his head. He could no longer pick up the fight with the witch. Miss Bargo laughed at this and warned that very soon her victim would start coughing up blood and red spots would start to appear. Zeke Moore realized that if he touched the plague blood, he would become infected, so he asked Joachim to immediately evacuate the regular soldiers and Hans and Sloka to leave here and take care of the people of the county. Joachim Dracula was shocked by what was happening, so he did not immediately begin to fulfill the main character's request. The guy could now only think about his older brother and father, who also needed help now. Joachim Drakel finally pulled himself together and made a decision about what needed to be done first. The guy loudly ordered the regular soldiers to evacuate immediately and the knights to deal with the witch, but under no circumstances to touch her blood. After this, Joachim Drakel also left the room because he understood that in his condition, he would be of little use here. Finally, he asked Zeke Moore not to take unnecessary risks and to take care of himself. The main character was left alone in the room and looking closely at his opponent, he tried to understand how he should deal with him. Meanwhile, Miss Bargo had already begun to attack the guy and was surprised that she now had to fight against Zeke Moore. The main character successfully blocked the woman's attacks, but mentally he was indignant because he didn't like fighting with magicians. Still, the guy decided that this needed to be ended quickly, so he began trying to close the distance and get closer to his opponent. Miss Bargo, despite her unsuccessful attacks, continued to take blows, laughing and saying that the main character was a good guard despite his character. So the woman suggested that Zeke Moore understand the stakes and have some fun. The next moment, the witch used her abilities to create a stream of energy that sprayed her infected blood everywhere. The main character saw this, so he immediately stopped and prepared to repel this attack despite his fatigue. He was already pretty tired of these magical attacks of the woman, but there was nothing to do, so the guy quickly concentrated mana in his sword. After that, he made a sharp swing of his weapon in order to protect himself from the spatter of the witch's blood. It was clear that Miss Bargo was clearly unhappy that all her attacks had failed. At this rate, the woman could lose this battle. At this time, the main character was only thinking that if he touched the plague blood, he would certainly catch an unknown disease. The guy also understood that if he gave the witch a careless cut, her blood would splatter in all directions. In addition, the woman had strong regeneration, so simple cuts were useless. Zeke Moore was already anticipating that this would not just be a grueling battle, but something even worse. Having analyzed all the information he had, the guy assumed that those parts of Miss Bargo's body that had not yet grown back needed to be immediately cauterized. After this, the main character immediately rushed into battle in order to test his theory. A moment later, Zeke Moore approached the woman and pierced her shoulder with his sword, blazing with fiery energy, causing her to let out a frantic cry of pain. The main character intended to immediately cut off his opponent's entire arm and cauterize the resulting wound with a sword in order to check whether a new limb would grow back. A few seconds later, the witch's right hand fell dead to the floor. After this, Zeke Moore smiled good-naturedly and turned to the woman and asked how she felt. Having received no answer, the guy assumed that Miss Bargo felt a slight burning sensation, as if from a small wound. At the same time, he carefully watched to see if her body was x-rayed. Despite the injuries she received, the woman still had her left hand, so she did not hesitate to use it to attack the main character. The guy had to retreat. Meanwhile, the excited witch turned back and thought that this was a good moment to do something. She wasn't going to just go and die right there, so without any doubts, the woman jumped out the window to escape from the main character. Zeke Moore was very unhappy that his opponent was running away right during the battle, and so he immediately rushed to catch him. The protagonist wondered whether he should have run after the woman at all, but still decided that it was best to destroy her outside the building and not allow her to leave the county. The guy also couldn't believe that he was running back and forth to reduce the damage to the residents and thought that the former demon lord Zeke Moore would definitely not appreciate it. Meanwhile, the chase continued. Frightened, Miss Bargo ran forward with all her might, demanding that the guy leave her alone and not pursue her. Zeke Moore laughed at this and said that the woman was going through the motions of lowering her welcoming tone, which actually sounded disgusting. Sometime later, the witch stopped to catch her breath because she simply could no longer continue her escape. Soon behind her, the woman heard the voice of the main character, who suggested that she finish this game of tag. Turning back, Miss Bargo saw Zeke Moore, who did not leave her side for a second and still held the flaming sword in his hand as he intended to finish what he started. Without saying another word, the protagonist began to swing his weapon in order to deliver the final blow to his opponent. Seeing this, the frightened witch immediately began to ask the guy to stop and even offered him a deal. The next moment, the woman fell silent as her body was pierced through and through by a fiery weapon. The witch's strength quickly began to leave her, which made her unable to stand on her feet any longer, and so she fell dead to the ground. Zeke Moore, who held his sword in his hands because he had not yet had time to attack, watched in surprise what was happening, not understanding how all this could have happened. The guy immediately began to examine the witch and realized that due to the fiery light that came from nowhere, she instantly died. Suddenly, the main character heard a quiet noise behind him, which also attracted his attention. Zeke Moore saw a dark figure nearby, hiding between the trees. He assumed that this person was behind the magic that killed Miss Bargo. He soon saw that it was a young girl with large red eyes and light hair that was hidden under a hood. Zeke Moore looked at what was left of Miss Bargo and could not believe that she was so badly burned by magic. Then the main character turned to the mysterious stranger who was hiding between the trees and asked who he was with. The hooded stranger realized that it was useless to hide, so he came out to the guy who assumed that he was a magician subordinate to Count Dracula. It turned out that it was a young girl with large, expressive eyes and light hair. She took off her hood in order to seem to introduce herself to the main character. Zeke Moore was surprised to see her and thought that this girl was very beautiful. Suddenly, she turned to him and asked if his name was Zeke Fortress. This question stunned the guy. The main character confirmed the stranger's guess and asked how she knew him. Along with this, The guy suggested that perhaps they had seen each other when they belonged to the same family, but he certainly would not be able to forget such a face. Suddenly, the girl bowed her head and for some reason began to regretfully deny her assumption. The stranger said in a quiet voice that the main character was definitely not Zeke Fortress. The guy felt that the atmosphere suddenly began to change dramatically. Then he asked if the girl didn't recognize him. The mysterious girl responded that she was absolutely sure that the guy's name was Zeke, but he had a different last name. The next moment, the stranger frowned, looked at the main character with a stern gaze, and stated that his last name was Moore. What the guy heard was like lightning striking him, because this girl should not have known his new last name. Without wasting time, Zeke Moore quickly moved forward in order to close the distance with the stranger whom he now considered his enemy. The main character undoubtedly attacked the girl, but it was not successful because in the blink of an eye, she managed to create a magical barrier that protected her. After that, it was the stranger's turn to attack the guy. To do this, she quickly expanded her magical barrier, which hit Zeke Moore hard. Having received a strong blow, the main character had to step back in order to think everything over and analyze the current situation. The guy began to think about who this stranger was because she knew his name from the time of the Demon Lord, who did not yet exist in this world. Zeke Moore decided to try to talk to the girl first, and therefore asked how she knew his name. The stranger only remained silent. Having received no answer, the protagonist assumed that she would not talk to him so easily, which meant that other measures had to be taken. Suddenly, the guy asked if the stranger wanted to go on a date with them since she didn't want to talk here. Then the main character smiled and agreed that it was indeed a sudden proposal. But the girl had aroused his interest, and so he did not want to waste time. To this, the stranger replied that it was a very nasty offer of a date. At the same time, she created magical seals in preparation for the next attack. The next moment, rapid streams of energy burst out from these seals and headed towards the main character. A puzzled Zeke Moore stood there and thought about what was happening right before his eyes. It was hard for him to believe what had happened. The main character looked intently at the stranger, not understanding where she got such abilities from. Although the guy was able to dodge the girl's attacks, he did not understand why she was so fast. Meanwhile, the unknown continued to attack the main character with destructive streams of energy, simultaneously uttering spells that sounded unintelligible, since they were abbreviations of the word. Zeke Moore, watching this, did not understand how the girl managed to use abbreviations to create spells and their effects. The guy also remembered that before that, her magical barrier appeared in a matter of seconds. Zeke Moore couldn't believe that this magician didn't even have to pronounce the spell completely to use it. Meanwhile, one of the girl's attacks, although a little, managed to reach its target, leaving a small cut on Zeke Moore's leg. Although it was not a serious wound at all, it was an indication that the main character was currently inattentive, which he did not like. After this, the guy began to watch his opponent more closely, trying to understand his strengths and weaknesses. Soon the protagonist realized that his opponent was a high-level magician, but he did not understand how at such a young age she was able to use such strong magic. Meanwhile, the stranger had already realized that something more serious had to be used against Zeke Moore. So she began to concentrate the energy in one place using her skills, increasing its destructive power. The next moment, the girl directed a huge flow of this energy straight at the main character, hoping to harm him in this way. Zeke Moore did not lose his head, and with a sharp swing of his sword, he was able to literally cut this energy charge. Now he was in no danger. After this, the guy decided not to waste time and attack his opponent in response. Jumping high and swinging his weapon, he flew straight at the stranger, intending to destroy her magical barrier. The girl was not at all afraid of this, and quickly placing her hands on the ground, she again read the spell from the abbreviated words, after which a magical seal appeared. At that very moment, a tall rock rose straight from the ground, protecting the magician from Zeke Moore's attack. The guy was unhappy that his attacks were unsuccessful, and he was also surprised that this stranger fought so skillfully. Meanwhile, the girl had no intention of stopping there and was already thinking about her next steps. Suddenly, the rock that was still sticking out of the ground began to grow sharply upward, which was accompanied by a loud sound. As it soon turned out, the girl did this in order to attack the main character, which is what she eventually succeeded in doing. In order not to give her opponent even a second to rest, the stranger had already used her next spell, which was a stream of raging flame. The next moment, the girl created a huge fireball and launched it straight at the main character, hoping that he would definitely not be able to survive such an attack. The fireball was approaching Zeke Moore at a tremendous speed, but he didn't even think about dodging it, but instead wanted to reflect the blow with his sword. In general, The guy was already tired of fighting against the magician and his countless spells, so he decided to act in an unconventional way. Suddenly, the protagonist threw his sword into the fireball like some kind of spear. This weapon was charged with the energy of Zeke Mora, so after contact with the huge ball, a reaction immediately began. The stranger clearly saw that something was not going according to her plan, which is why she became very worried. The next moment, a huge explosion occurred that destroyed the protagonist's sword. However, the guy was not upset at all, and even on the contrary, his gaze was calm and his lips spread into a smile as if he would get what he wanted. At the same time, Zeke Moore clenched his hand into a fist and then concentrated his mana into it as if he was going to use it right now. Suddenly, the main character, seeing the approaching fireball, swung his fist, simultaneously inviting his opponent to try to repel his attack. After that, the guy punched the fireball with all his might, thereby changing its flight path and sending it flying in the opposite direction. Now, this fireball was directed straight at the stranger who created it, but stopping it was much more difficult. Very soon, this force hit the protective barrier directly. He was able to withstand the main attack, but small fragments of the fireball were still able to pass further and injure the magician. However, the girl still remained standing on her feet, so Zeke Moore began to think that his idea had not worked out very well. After this, the stranger raised her head and, gritting her teeth, looked angrily at the main character with her red eyes. Zeke Moore understood from just this look that the girl was very angry, and now he would have problems because of it. Without wasting any time, the magician began to read his next spell, thanks to which mysterious glowing patterns appeared above his head. Suddenly, the girl stopped her ability because she felt a strange feeling, and her body began to tremble as if from powerlessness. Meanwhile, the battle continued. Zeke Moore deftly dodged attacks, thinking along the way that the girl had probably been reborn, because then it would explain everything. However, the guy thought that for the reborn, she seemed to move somehow strangely and seemed unable to bear the pain. The main character already knew well how high the skills of this stranger were in battle, because he literally tested them on himself. That is why Zeke Moore believed that it could not be said about the girl that pain was something unusual for her. The main character could not describe it in one word, but observing his opponent, he had an idea. The guy believed that all the combat experience that the girl had was somehow artificially obtained by her. These thoughts were interrupted when suddenly someone turned to the main character. He immediately looked to the side in order to understand who needed him. It was Joachim Drakel, who saw a small wound on the boy's leg and therefore asked if everything was okay with him. Zeke Moore was sure that everything was fine with him, after which he advised him to stay away because the guy could have been hurt during the fight. Suddenly, Joachim Dracula's extremely surprised subordinate drew his master's attention to something strange. They saw all that was left of Miss Bargo and immediately asked if it was Zeke Moore who had finished her off. The main character honestly answered that it was not him who did it, after which he looked at the stranger who was still in place and cautiously watched what was happening. Everyone was surprised that this girl turned Miss Bargo into coals. Zeke Moore confirmed this again and added that this stranger was a top-level magician. Suddenly, one of the knights stood in front of the main character and, drawing his sword, said that if the stranger attacked Zeke Moore first, he would perceive her as his enemy. The main character was about to confirm that it was the girl who provoked this battle, but suddenly he fell silent. The guy remembered that he was the one who attacked the stranger first, thanks to which he knew that she could create a magical barrier. Because of this, Zeke Moore felt awkward. Still, the guy admitted that it turned out that he was the first to attack the girl. The knight was shocked by this and now did not know what to do. The main character began to justify himself by saying that he did it unconsciously because he heard several shocking words, and so he had no reason to fight with her. The guy also believed that he shouldn't forget that it was this stranger who helped get rid of the witch and her harmful blood. That is why the main character loudly addressed the girl in order to calmly talk to her. Zeke Moore admitted that it was his mistake and therefore asked the stranger for forgiveness. The guy continued saying that everything would have been much easier if the girl had also talked to him before engaging in battle with him. Suddenly, the stranger interrupted Zeke Moore's speech because she wanted to ask him about something. It was obvious that for some reason it was difficult for her to talk to him. Still, she asked whether the people who surrounded the main character were his subordinates, to which she received a short negative answer. Then the guy also briefly told that they were all his colleagues. The girl was very surprised to hear this, as if such relationships between people could not exist at that time. Zeke Moore did not understand this surprise, so he repeated again that they were colleagues and no one here was subordinate to him. After this, the guy again thanked the stranger for helping him kill the witch, because thanks to this, civilians were not harmed. The stranger continued to be surprised by every word of the main character and could not believe that he really said all this. Zeke Moore didn't understand what the problem was, so he decided to listen to what the girl had to say. An unexpected stranger asked with malice in her voice, "Since when did the guy care about people suffering?" Zeke Moore didn't like such questions from a girl who didn't even tell who she was. After that, there was absolute silence for a while. The main character looked closely at the stranger, trying to understand who she really was. The guy was very interested in the question of whether she really knew him before his reincarnation. Did the stranger know that same Zeke Mora who was the Lord of Demons? Suddenly, the same loud voice in which one could feel discontent addressed the girl again. It soon became clear that it was not Zeke Moore, because he himself was surprised by what was happening and only stood silently in place. It was one of the knights who loudly asked how the girl dared to speak in such a tone to Zeke Moore, who was the hero of the city of Osperin. The stranger was very surprised that this guy was called a hero. At the same time, Zeke Moore was pleased with this tiger and therefore happily accepted him. The knight, almost with tears in his eyes, confirmed that this was indeed the case, because the main character did many good deeds for their county. The girl couldn't just believe it, so she asked the guy if his name was really Zeke and what his last name was. The main character replied that it didn't matter. Then Zeke Moore said that he did not know what information the girl had and in what quantity, but asked her not to impose her thoughts on him. The stranger didn't respond to this because she was completely focused on thinking about what she had just heard from the guy. She still found it hard to believe that the main character standing in front of her really wasn't the same Zeke Moore she knew. Still, the stranger said hesitantly that it was something completely different and she had no intention of imposing her thoughts on anyone. Zeke Moore was surprised and didn't understand the girl at all, so he thought that there was no point in wasting any more time on this conversation. He then threatened that if she did not tell who she was, she would be considered a trespasser. The main character didn't have time to finish speaking because he saw some object in the stranger's hand that, for no apparent reason, began to emit a bright light. A moment later, a mysterious energy completely enveloped the girl. It looked as if she had been swallowed by a sphere of electricity, but none of those present still understood what kind of light it was. Only Zeke Moore suggested that it was some kind of magical artifact. He tried not to take his eyes off the stranger despite the blinding light. At the same time, the girl looked quite determined, but she did not need this in order to enter the battle again. The stranger seemed to look at the main character with regret because she was still troubled by some thoughts. The next moment, strong gusts of wind arose, which forced our heroes to look away. As soon as everything was over, Hans was the first to look at the stranger in order to find out what was happening to her, but he was very surprised by what he saw. It turned out that the girl had already disappeared somewhere, leaving behind only a small amount of energy that gradually dissipated. Zeke Moore began to think that the creation of the artifact itself was not a small achievement, so it was hard to believe that this girl had an artifact of super high magic that allowed her to move through space. Now the main character was really interested in who this stranger really was. Some time passed. The morning in the city of Osperina began with the ringing of bells in the large chapel. Joachim Dracul looked at this chapel and thought that his father and older brother would certainly not be able to get to heaven. The guy's loyal subordinate considered that this was the price of their atonement for the deeds they had committed during their lifetime, also sure that they were prepared for such an outcome. It was difficult for Joachim Dracula to talk about this because despite everything, they remained his father and brother. After this, the boy turned to Zeke Moore and expressed his gratitude to him for being present at the funeral. The main character thought that Joachim Dracula shouldn't thank him for that. Hans and Slock agreed with their teacher. Then the young count decided that they still needed to organize a search and find out who exactly was the magician they had met in the forest that night. Zeke Moore replied that there was no need to worry about it since that girl had used the artifact anyway and now it was impossible to find her trace. After this, the guy thought that this stranger definitely knew him in a past life, so now he needed to slowly unravel this tangle of events. Zeke Moore was distracted from these thoughts by Joachim Dracul, who was looking at him intently, as if he did not want to disturb him, but really wanted to continue their conversation. The guy heard that our heroes were already getting ready to set off on their journey. Zeke Moore explained that they had only made a stop in this county, and now they needed to move on. Joachim Dracul understood this, but it seemed he wanted to make one proposal to his new comrades, for which he collected his thoughts. Still, he asked if our heroes would like to settle down in his county and guaranteed the best treatment. Zeke Moore refused this offer. After that, the guy smiled sincerely and began to assure that even if he was not here, nothing terrible would happen to the county, because it would be led by Joachim Dracul. The guy did not agree with this and said that even this time, If it were not for Zeke Moore and his companions, the city of Ospurin would have suffered a great disaster. Joachim Dracula also recalled with regret that during the battle he was somehow able to resist his fear of blood, but when it was all over he fell down without strength. The guy was very upset and worried about this because he thought that the Count of County Dracula, who was a hemophobe, looked pathetic. Unexpectedly, Zeke Moore, in order to help his comrade cope with these experiences, reached into a small bag hanging on his belt and began to look for something there. Joachim Dracula was so shocked when he saw what the main character got that he lost his speech for a moment and just looked at the guy with his mouth open. It turned out that Zeke Moore was handing Joachim Dracula a mysterious artifact, the blood vessel, and was asking him in all seriousness if he wanted to use it. Joachim Dracula was very surprised when he saw the magical artifact and asked if it was not the thing that the unknown hooded man offered him to take back in prison. Zeke Moore confirmed this and added that he had retrieved this bloody vessel from under the rubble. The guy continued to say that in the future, there would come a day when hemophobia could become an obstacle for Joachim Dracula, and in order to prevent this from happening, he should take this thing. Zeke Moore gave away the magical artifact, while assuring him that it would grant its owner mastery of blood. Joachim Dracula thought that this sounded like something not very good. Then the guy said that it was an ability with which one could manipulate the surrounding blood, but due to excessive greed, one could become obsessed with it. Joachim Dracula became concerned that if he began to thirst for the blood of other people, it could cause great chaos, so he wondered if there was some ability to prevent this. The main character tries to calm his comrade down, promising that if his mind is captured by the ability, he will come and kill him with his own hands. Some time passed. It was deep night, but the lights were still burning in the windows of Count Dracula's palace. Joachim Dracula himself sat alone at his desk and thought about something carefully. Suddenly the guy heard a knock on the door. He immediately understood who had come to see him and therefore allowed them to enter. It was Joachim's loyal subordinate Dracula who brought him a huge stack of documents that he needed to look at. The guy saw this and sighed heavily. The knight noticed that his master looked very tired. Joachim said that earlier at this time, he was already asleep, so he was already beginning to miss the time when he was weak from illness. However, the man was happy for his master and believed that the bloody vessel really had a strong effect on him because he became much healthier than before, which was very noticeable. Then the loyal subordinate asked how Joachim Dracula's thirst for blood, which should have already appeared in him, had wished for it. The guy honestly admitted that sometimes he had a desire to snack on blood, but after a while it disappeared on its own. At the same time, he touched his small wound on his finger. Joachim then demonstrated his new skills and suggested that now he had no need to control the blood of other people, since so far he had been doing an excellent job with his own. Brod was fascinated by this action because before this, he had never seen how his master possessed blood. The man considered this spectacle amazing. Joachim Dracula explained that it would be useful for him to be able to defend himself independently, and that is why he trained in this ability from time to time. After this, Brod shared with his master the questions that puzzled him. The man did not understand how Zeke Moore could know about all this. The guy thought that they didn't need to know the answers to this, because the main character was the savior who protected their county anyway. Joachim Dracula continued to say that in his land such a status was quite sufficient. After this, the guy suddenly got up from the table and turned to his subordinate, because he wanted to tell him something else. Looking mysteriously out the window, the young count informed the man that he needed to investigate something. Brod obediently prepared to listen to his master's order. Joachim Dracula instructed the knight to find out about the man in black who helped spread the plague, as well as about the magician girl who attacked Zeke Moore. At this time, our heroes stopped in the forest to rest. They did not settle in as comfortably as they could have if they had lived in the Count's palace, but such conditions were already more familiar to them. Sloka, as the youngest, had been sleeping carefree for a long time, hugging Novem. At this time, the main character closely watched the dance of the flames and wondered who that girl really was. The guy was sure that she knew that his name before reincarnation was Zeke Moore, but he did not remember that as a demon lord he met a person with such an appearance. In terms of skills, this girl reminded him of the demonic lord of magic, who in the second half of the era was one of the demonic lords along with him, that is, the embodiment of horror itself. The main character recalled that this man was fluent in all kinds of magic, and they even crossed paths a couple of times. However, Zeke Moore clearly remembered that this demonic lord of magic was a man, and also very old. No one except this old man came to the guy's mind. Because of this, he was unhappy, because before he had never forgotten something like this. Zeke Moore then suggested that if that girl returned just like him, it meant that she had something to do with the key that distorts fate. Perhaps it was she who transplanted him into the main character, but the guy understands that this was only his assumption and nothing more. Remembering that battle as well as the face and emotions of the girl, Zeke Moore thought that it was all very strange. The main character was very concerned about why she was looking at him with such a look at that moment. Zeke Moore was distracted from all these thoughts by Hans, who hesitantly addressed him. The main character here began to listen attentively to his student. The guy was worried about the words that Zeke Moore said last time. Namely, that in that situation, the priority was to deal with Miss Bargo and not to save the inhabitants of Osperin. The main character immediately assumed that his student did not like his decision. Hans immediately fell silent because he was afraid to say what he really thought. Zeke Moore understood the guy, but explained that in order to prevent numerous casualties, it was impossible to ignore the reason for what happened, which was right before his eyes. After this, the main character asked the guy if he really wanted to become a hero or even a god. The guy then added that even a super genius like him couldn't achieve absolutely everything he wanted, and in the future there won't be a person who can do it. Hearing this, Hans suddenly asked if his teacher really thought that he could become a hero in the future. Zeke Moore thought about this question while looking intently at his student, but his gaze was slightly indifferent. Still, he answered that if the guy wanted this, he could try to become a hero. These, greatly surprised Hans and gave him hope. Zeke Moore will continue to say that as long as the guy remained his subordinate, he would help him in any way he could. After this, Hans asked if there really wasn't a way when it was possible to save more people when making a decision. The protagonist answered that there really was such a way. Without waiting for a detailed explanation, Hans asked directly how this could be achieved. Zeke Moore replied that there was nothing special about it, because it was simply necessary to become stronger. In other words, the teacher was telling his student that he had to train even harder if he really wanted to save more people. Dawn soon came, but this did not mean that the day promised to be calm and carefree for our heroes. A bloodthirsty predator was already approaching them, who was the master of this forest and intended to deal with the uninvited guests. The situation was aggravated by the fact that this predator was not alone. The wolf, with eyes burning with rage, was leading an entire pack. The first one the predators noticed was Slock, who was sitting on the ground and fearlessly looking into the eyes of danger. The next moment, several bloodthirsty monsters rushed at the guy, intending to tear him to shreds while he sat meekly in one place. However, the predator's wait was in vain, because Sloka was sitting on the ground for a reason. He was waiting for the right moment to use his ability and at the same time practice on real opponents. After just a couple of seconds, a huge stone pillar rose from the ground and mercilessly pierced all the aggressive wolves. After this, the guy and his little friend sighed with relief, because although he was confident in his abilities, it was impossible to get used to meetings with a bloodthirsty enemy. However, the guy relaxed too early, because several more wolves were approaching him, who were clearly unhappy with the fact that he had killed members of their pack. Despite this, the dangerous predators had to worry about themselves and save themselves as quickly as possible, because another enemy had already appeared behind them. It only took Hans a few swings of his sword to disable the wolves, which showed that his skills had improved significantly and that his lessons had not been in vain. After this, the guy breathed a sigh of relief, happy that he managed to do everything without a single mistake. At this time, Zeke Moore approached our heroes and asked if his students had finished fighting these monsters. By kicking one of the wolves, the main character made sure that he really died and no longer posed any danger to them. Suddenly, Hans asked his teacher why there were so many monsters here, because despite the success, it was still dangerous for them. Sloka agreed with his friend and was worried that these monsters could harm the inhabitants of the village that was located right next to this forest. Hearing all this, Zeke Moore thought about it and mentally agreed that there really were too many monsters here, so he began to wonder what it was about this area that attracted them so much. Suddenly, someone's voice addressed our heroes. Everyone immediately looked to the side in order to understand who else could be in this wilderness at such a time. It was an elderly man who was carrying a large bag with him, and behind him was an impressive spear. He noticed that the guys looked quite strong. That is why the old man asked if they could help him. This surprised the main character very much, but it was clear from him that he was not going to refuse someone in need. The old man told our heroes that the reason for the appearance of such a large number of monsters in this forest was the orc. Zeke Moore was surprised to hear this. The old man continued to say that this monster was walking on the mountain nearby, so he was interested in whether the guys could help deal with it. The old man was worried that the appearance of this monster could cause trouble for those residents who had climbed here. Zeke Moore began to think about this request. Soon our heroes came across huge footprints on the ground, which meant that they had responded to the call for help. A huge bare footprint was clearly imprinted in the mud, which clearly could not have belonged to a human. Slock was amazed by this and assumed that this trace really belonged to an orc. Hans also suggested that there might not have been one monster in this forest, but a whole group that moved together. In any case, the main character decided that the first thing they needed to do now was look for other tracks around the area. Suddenly, Sloka asked if they would be able to find anything at all with just this clue. Zeke Moore admitted that he was not very good at following tracks. Hans was surprised by this and asked how they would then look for the monster. The students immediately froze in anticipation of an answer from their teacher, who was already prepared to tell them about his plan. The next moment, the protagonist said that they should walk around the area, look at everything, and listen until they feel the presence of the monster. After this, Zeke Moore asked the boys to follow him faster. Hans and Sloka were not at all happy with this plan. The main character confidently walked forward and looked around, thinking that of course he couldn't compare with the professionals, but he knew the basic principles of working on such hooks. The guy continued to think that the range of his sensations was wide, and Hans and Slock walked very quickly, so in a few days they should definitely find this orc. Suddenly, the main character stopped because he saw something strange in the distance in front of him. A small boy was moving towards our heroes, and because of his appearance, Zeke Moore became suspicious. The guy assumed that he was an undead. Sloka was very surprised and did not understand what a small child was doing so far in the mountains, and Hans was amazed at how thin and weak this boy was. Suddenly, the main character turned to Hans to do something, but the guy did not immediately understand everything. At this time, the child who had suddenly appeared continued to walk forward and did not notice at all what was happening around him, because he was only thinking about the fact that he really wanted to eat. Suddenly, he saw in front of him the hand of a stranger who was holding out a large loaf of bread to him. The boy immediately looked up and saw the face of his benefactor, who was sure that this bread was very tasty. It was Zeke Moore who, with a smile on his face, offered the child to try this bread. After this, our heroes stopped at a tavern in a small village and began to search the mountains in order to find the monster. It was only after several days deep in the night that they managed to find the orcs in their habitat. The elimination of this threat to our heroes took place without any problems. It could be considered that for Hans and Sloka, this was another training session of their skills. The old man who asked for help, seeing the result of the guy's work, was amazed and asked if they really didn't need money as a reward. Zeke Moore refused it. However, the elderly man who turned out to be the head of the village still thanked our heroes by treating them to a hearty dinner, calling them the saviors of the village. However, this was not the end of this little story. Our heroes still remained in this village. The boy they met on the way began to often come to Zeke Moore, who was not at all against it. One day, the main character quietly crept up to a thoughtful child, which scared him. The boy began to complain about this and asked why the guy scared him like that every time. Zeke Moore didn't respond to this, but instead, as always, handed the child some bread. This happened every time they met, but the boy was still surprised by it. The main character looked at this child with a smile and thought that all he ever did was help him do good deeds. The child was in no hurry to accept this help and hesitantly said that he had not come here to beg. To this, the guy said that the boy should not have rejected gifts from adults. Still, the child took the bread, remembering the words of his mother who said that you couldn't take anything from strangers. Zeke Moore assumed that she was talking about bad adults. Hearing this, the child asked if the main character was really a good adult. The boy was greatly surprised by Zeke Moore's response, which said that he was not a good adult. Immediately after this, the main character, with a wide smile on his face, clarified that he was a bad adult who tried to live a good life. After some time, Zeke Moore and the child were sitting on the street and talking. Zeke Moore asked the boy to eat more slowly so that his stomach wouldn't hurt. He also offered him water. The child did not refuse this because he was really tormented by thirst, but he was embarrassed to ask. At this point, the boy's meal was completed because he still had some things to do. Zeke Moore, noticing that the child began to take out his handkerchief, suggested that today he would again take bread home. The boy confirmed this by saying that he wanted to share with his mom and dad. After this, the child began to carefully wrap the bread in a handkerchief so that it would not get dirty. The main character was surprised at how kind this boy was. After that, he asked what his parents were doing. He was unhappy because it seemed that they did not care about their child at all. The boy immediately began to deny this and said that the guy was wrong, but he did not go into details. After that, the child said that he heard that the whole village was talking about the main character being a kind person and also being able to catch the orcs. Zeke Moore confirmed this, but he felt uneasy that people called him a good man. Suddenly, the main character asked the boy to come to their tavern, and seeing his look, said that the child did not need to look at him as if he were some kind of criminal in an alley. However, that was not the point. The boy said that if people like him entered this establishment, swearing would immediately begin. Zeke Moore began to assure that the child had nothing to worry about because he had already talked to me, the owner, and agreed on everything. This surprised the boy very much. Then he asked why the main character treated him so well, since all the other people hated him. Zeke Moore immediately asked about the reason for this. Along the way, the guy remembered that everything was the same as back then with Timmy. Once the main character also helped a child, which surprised him greatly because it was the first time that someone helped him just like that without any conditions. At that moment, Timmy's words truly shocked Zeke Moore, and the tears in the child's eyes only increased this feeling. Still, the main character answered that, compared to some people, he was indeed kinder. The child did not understand this because just recently the guy said that he was a bad adult who tried to live a good life. Zeke Moore heard this and decided that he would then be a bad adult who was kinder than those same kind people. These words confused the child even more. Suddenly the main character heard laughter that the little boy could hardly contain. This surprised the guy. The child laughed sincerely, not understanding how what Zeke Moore had just said was even possible. To this the guy said that all his words were true, and there really was a person like him in the world. The little boy would really like for the world to have many people like the main character, because then the world would truly become cool. After this, Zeke Moore noticed the time and realized that it was already quite late. The child agreed with this and decided that it was time for him to return home. The boy said goodbye to his new acquaintance and quickly ran away, not forgetting to take with him the bread given to him by the main character. Zeke Moore was also already returning to the tavern. Suddenly, the guy stopped because he remembered that he wanted to ask the child about something else. The main character turned around, but the boy had already disappeared without a trace. Zeke Moore was surprised that he left so quickly. After some time, the child was already approaching a destroyed village in which it seemed no one had lived for a long time. The boy with a smile on his face and bread in his hands quickly ran forward, hoping that his mom and dad would be happy. Suddenly, the child began to worry that he so often accepted food from the main character, but did not even know his name. So he decided that tomorrow, he would definitely ask him about it. The boy needed to know this in order to one day be able to repay him for his kindness. Suddenly, the child stopped because he saw in the distance a stranger in a hood whom he had not seen before, together with his uncle from the village. The boy decided to watch what would happen next. Unexpectedly, the first handed the second a small bag with something heavy and bells inside. After this, the man from the village immediately hid it, while being very nervous. The child who witnessed this felt that there was some kind of strange atmosphere here. Still, the child decided that he needed to leave here as soon as possible. At this time, the stranger took off his hood, due to which his unusual tattoos became visible. The next moment he turned sharply towards the boy, and with a crazy smile on his face, said that he had found an annoying bug that was meddling in other people's business. The little boy was very frightened by the appearance of the stranger, which instilled in him a feeling of fear and danger. At this time, the main character, unlike his students, was not yet asleep, and looking at the night sky was meticulously thinking about something. Zeke Moore doubted whether he should give the child not only bread but also something else next time. The guy was also surprised by the fact that they didn't even know each other's names, but they communicated so well, so Zeke Moore assumed that they really had become good friends. Still, the main character decided that tomorrow he would definitely ask the child his name. The guy, of course, did not know what was happening right now in the dark, gloomy forest. The little boy felt incredible danger, cried loudly and tried to protect himself as best he could until the last, hoping for someone's help. Soon a new day arrived. Our heroes immediately got to work, and by lunchtime they had dealt with another group of orcs. Hans asked her teacher if that would be enough for today. Sloka was also interested in this question, because in those places that they had examined before, they had cleaned everything again, and only these remained of the monster. Zeke Moore thought and began to reflect that there were no more signs of any new monsters approaching. The guy also clearly felt that their numbers had decreased, and perhaps these creatures were forced out onto the mountain due to the change in the strength of the monsters in the area. The main character was happy that at least for a while this village would no longer suffer from monsters or animals that came down from the mountain. After this, the satisfied guy declared that their work was finished and praised his students, suggesting that they return back to the village. After some time, our heroes were already in the village and received sincere gratitude from the head of the settlement and its residents. The older man insisted that it was only thanks to the boys that they could live in safety, and therefore they deserved to be paid for their kindness. Hans might have been happy to accept some payment, but he followed the protagonist's example and said that it was unnecessary. Unexpectedly, Slock noticed that today he had not yet seen the child whom they had recently met in the forest and to whom Zeke Moore had repeatedly given food. The guy was worried about this because this boy was always here when they went down the mountain. The main character was a little upset about this because he wanted to see him one more time before leaving. Unexpectedly, the head of the village asked whether our heroes had spoken about the child who lived behind the palisade. This interested Zeke Moore. One of the villagers said that he had not seen this child for a couple of days, although he usually came to help him with all sorts of household things. Hans thought that the boy might have decided to go somewhere else, since this was not the only village in the area. However, Slock was still worried. Suddenly, the main character, without explaining anything, called his students to follow him. The boys did not resist this. Hans only asked where Zeke Moore had decided to go this time, and if they had any destination. Sloka was also interested in this question. Unexpectedly for the guys, the main character said that he did not yet know where exactly they should go. This surprised Hans very much. After this, Zeke Moore suggested that his students go to the child's home and check if everything was okay with him. After some time, our heroes had already arrived at the empty village and were walking along the quiet, deserted streets, carefully looking around. Hans felt uneasy here, and Sloka was interested in why everything here was so destroyed, although people definitely lived here before. Zeke Moore himself did not know the answer to this question, but with the help of his skills, he felt that now there was not a single trace of people here. The main character was worried and wondered what could happen to that child while remembering their last meeting. Suddenly, the guy felt some kind of feeling that seriously alarmed him. Without explaining anything to his students, Zeke Moore suddenly jumped up and quickly rushed forward, leaving the bewildered guys behind. After some time, the main character stopped at the entrance to one of the seemingly non-residential buildings. He seemed afraid to go inside and see what was there. The reason for this was that Zeke Moore, using his abilities, clearly felt that someone was dying inside the house right now. Still, the guy took the plunge and kicked the door down and went inside. Right at the threshold, the main character saw the lifeless bodies of a man and a woman who clearly did not die a natural death. However, this was not the most shocking sight in this house. Zeke Moore was struck by something even more terrible. The guy saw that same child who was now unconscious. In addition to this, the large seal that was visible on the boy's chest was frightening. Alarmed, Zeke Moore immediately rushed to the child in order to help him and bring him to his senses. The guy saw that the boy was still breathing, and therefore assumed that if he used the potion now, he could still be saved. However, this was not the only problem that Zeke Moore was worried about. There was something more than the child's unconscious state. The guy clearly saw that streams of ominous energy were emanating from the seal that was applied to the boy's chest. At that moment, the child suddenly woke up and asked if he really saw his friend in front of him, as if he did not believe what was happening. The main character happily confirmed that it was him. After that, the child asked how the guy ended up there. Zeke Moore explained that the child had not appeared in the village for a long time, and therefore he decided to come to him himself this time. It seemed that the boy was very happy to hear this, but he could not fully enjoy this moment because of the events he had recently experienced. Then the main character asked what happened to the boy and who did all this. The exhausted child timidly answered that he did not know this person. The boy said that for the first time he saw this strange stranger who suddenly appeared at night. Then the child remembered that the first terrible thing befell his father. Immediately after this, his mother also lost her life at the hands of an unknown assailant. The child also remembered that the stranger promised him that his parents would stay alive if he did not scream. The boy was in great pain, but he tried his best to endure it. The main character summed up that the stranger tortured the child and said that he would leave his parents alive if he did not scream, but in the end he killed them anyway. Zeke Moore immediately decided that the unknown person was doing all this just for fun, which the guy was very unhappy about. Suddenly the child began to tremble with fear when he remembered that after the death of his parents, the stranger went to the people from the neighboring houses in order to do the same to them. They all died. The child blamed himself for this, which is why he cried bitterly and could not calm down. At that moment, Zeke Moore put his hand on the boy's head and calmly asked him not to worry so much. The main character began to assure the child that all this was not his fault. After that, the guy asked if he could see the face of that scoundrel. The boy said that the stranger had no hair and had a strange tattoo on half of his face. Suddenly, the child began to experience severe pain, from which he immediately grabbed the seal on his chest. Zeke Moore immediately understood what was happening and therefore, in order to help, he concentrated mana in his right hand. After this, the main character put his hand on the seal, which emitted ominous energy. As soon as he grabbed this energy, Zeke Moore jerked his hand as if he had torn it out of the boy's body. A moment later, the seal left by the villain on the child's chest completely disappeared, leaving no trace. It seemed that now everything would be fine with him. Zeke Moore praised the child for his efforts and then said that he would figure it out himself. The boy was happy, and therefore smiled. Suddenly, the child's eyes began to slowly close. He could no longer resist it. Soon the boy's hand fell limply to the floor. In the end, he could only thank the main character for his kindness. Zeke Moore looked sadly at the lifeless body of the child, whose name he never managed to find out. After this, the main character took out a small bag that he brought with him especially for this boy. It turned out that it contained the same bread that the guy had been treating him to recently. Zeke Moore put it in the child's hand. Perhaps the main character wanted to stay here alone with his thoughts for some time, but he was distracted by a sudden noise. The reason for this was Hans and Sloka, who, after a long search, were finally able to find their teacher. The guys were shocked when they saw what was happening in this house and understood everything without words, but this did not make it easier for them to accept what had happened. The main character, seeing his students, immediately began to rise from his seat, ordering them to prepare for immediate dispatch. Zeke Moore explained that now they would go to the one who could help them avenge this innocent child. Of course, the guy was talking about Aina Luvella, who was currently going about her usual business and didn't even suspect what was waiting for her ahead. It was deep night, but the bright light from the large fire was able to easily drive away the darkness, albeit not for long. Our heroes stood silently near the old house and watched as the flames gradually consumed it. Soon the fire penetrated inside to take away the lifeless bodies of innocent people who became victims of an unknown person who had recently appeared in these parts. Slock was very sorry about what happened and wished that the flame would send the souls of these people to a better place. Novem shared his friend's feelings. At this time, Hans looked at his teacher and was surprised that he had arranged a funeral for an unknown boy whom he had seen only a few times. Moreover, it was hard to believe that the main character was also going to avenge the death of this child. Hans didn't believe that Zeke Moore did all this out of a sense of justice or anything like that. The guy admitted that it was, of course, a good deed, but he believed that Zeke Moore was not the kind of person who would start acting on such a matter. However, the death of this child made the protagonist's favor useless, and moreover, this boy died such a cruel death. Hans was sure that these two things definitely hurt Zeke Moore's pride. With these thoughts, the night passed unnoticed. Morning came, and everything that remained of the dead people was carefully collected and folded on a piece of cloth. Zeke Moore personally did this while Hans and Sloka stood silently to the side and obediently waited for him. The main character carefully collected the surviving bones into a large pot in order to honor the memory of the dead. Soon the boy finished everything he wanted to do and began to rise from his seat. Hans and Slock were still obediently waiting and did not interfere with their teacher. Finally, Zeke Moore turned to his students and said that they could now set out on their journey. At the end of the large and bright hall grew a tree that symbolized life itself. On all sides, it was surrounded by high columns and arches. Aina Luvella, having finished all her business, went out into the corridor where someone was already waiting for her. The girl was very surprised when she saw this man, because she never expected that he would be here now. It turned out that it was Servaig. He did not hide the fact that he was glad to see Aina Luvella. The elderly man immediately asked if the prayer had gone well, to which the girl answered affirmatively with a smile. After that, she asked what happened since the old man was here. Servaig happily informed the girl that a good friend had visited them. Aina Luvella was very surprised by this statement, because she did not understand what kind of good friend they were talking about. At this time, the unexpected guest was expecting to meet the girl and was passing the time over a cup of tea. Zeke Moore calmly sipped his drink, while his students looked around in great surprise. Hans was amazed by the setting and thought that it all looked even more grandiose than in the Karuviman Order Church. Slock was also amazed and thought that the main character's connections were truly extensive. Finally, Aina Luvella and Servaig entered the room. Our hero immediately rose from their seats and greeted them, The girl asked if everything was okay with them. Servaig, smiling good-naturedly, extended his hand to the main character, saying along the way that he was glad to see him in good health. Zeke Moore shook the old man's hand, but at that moment he could only think about how he could not get used to the smile of a real death machine. Ina Luvella was also very glad to see her old friend, but she was also interested in who the third guest was who had arrived with him. Hans said that it was his friend whose name was Sloka, and the mole next to him was Novum. The guy bowed respectfully, greeting the girl. After that, Zeke Moore smiled and said that, while they were waiting for their old friends, they heard the latest news about Ina Luvell. They said that the girl would not be long before receiving the second name Primel, which could only be given to holy ladies. Ina Luvella was embarrassed that the main character knew about this. Servaig was surprised that the boy had already found out about this, and added that all that was left to make a final decision was to establish the rationale. The protagonist knew that the old man meant to obtain consent from the holy lady Karuna. Suddenly, Zeke Moore asked what his acquaintances thought about a big and impressive case instead of some trifle. This question surprised Servaig and Ina Luvella. The next moment, the protagonist, with a sly smile on his face, suggested that they destroy the Belid unit in the northern part of the country. Some time passed, Zeke Moore told what happened and why he came here. Servaig listened attentively to everything, nervously tapping his finger on the table. Ina Luvella was shocked by the story that Zeke Moore told and could not utter a word. The old man, full of rage, asked if the murder of the child to whom the boy had treated well was really the work of the people from Belid. Zeke Moore confirmed this and then showed the sign that was on the boy's chest. Servaig said that this sign was used to prevent a person from dying prematurely. Hans was very surprised that dark magic was used on the child in order to make it last longer. Servaig said that this magic kept a person alive for a predetermined period of time, even if he was mortally wounded. It was usually used to keep a person alive during torture, or as they said, to play with people. Servaig then asked if the protagonist had any information about who exactly killed that child and his family. Zeke Moore replied that according to the boy, he was attacked by a bald man, half of whose face was covered with a tattoo. This description was enough for Ina Luvella to remember and timidly name Kalon Trislova. Zeke Moore was surprised by this and immediately asked if the girl really knew this scoundrel. Ina said that it was one of the cardinals who was directly subordinate to the Holy Father of the Belid clan. The girl continued to say that this man was famous as the one who created all sorts of horrors in this world. Servaig was surprised that the conversation turned specifically to this man, and therefore asked if he had simply appeared in the village. Zeke Moore suggested that Kalun Trislova might have simply been passing by that village and stopped to buy provisions, and at the same time decided to have some fun. The guy continued to tell that the victims were only poor people living on the outskirts, so there was no unrest in the village itself. Servaig was very outraged by this. In addition, the main character considered it strange that there were quite a lot of monsters living in the mountains around the village, and even orcs had made a haven for themselves there. The elderly man, having heard all this, thought about it, and said that all this was certainly not just like that. Still, the old man declared that if they went against the people from Belid, then he and Karaviman were ready to run to any battlefield. Servaig also noted that they had little information about the enemy base. To this, Zeke Moore said that he knew the location of the northern division of Belid, as well as the location of another base. The old man was so happy to hear this that he jumped up from his seat and declared that it was a great benefit from the interaction between Lady Ina Luvella and Zeke Moore. At the same time, the girl was interested in where the main character learned such reliable data, because it was not easy to get information about Belid. The guy briefly answered that he learned everything by chance. Ina Luvella was amazed that Zeke Moore knew so much, and even had information about the runes drawn during the incident in the city of Pontus. The guy immediately realized that the girl was talking about the runes that he had drawn to seal the demon statue. These were the very same runes that Ina Luvella drew during her fight with the demonic lord before the main character was reborn. Of course, Zeke Moore couldn't tell her about this. After that, Servaig suggested that we first go to the northern base of Belid in order to check this location. The guy agreed with this proposal. As he left the room, the old man also said that judging by the fact that that place was their first destination, after checking, the priority would be to deal with Colin Trislov. After this, Servaig asked if Zeke Moore's main goal was only revenge. Hearing this question, the guy suddenly stopped and fell silent, as if it was difficult for him to talk about it. Still, the main character, with regret that he tried to hide, answered that it was because of Kalun Trislov that he did not even have time to hear the name of that boy. After some time, our heroes reached the mountainous desert area where they were met by inhospitable landscapes. The only way to move around here was on horseback, so as not to waste precious energy. Sir Vague looked around and was surprised that the world was truly full of wonders. He would never have even thought that places like this existed. From this reaction, Zeke Moore realized that the old man, despite his experience, had never met such a person. Sir Vague used to believe that he had seen enough of the world, but now he realized that he had been too arrogant. The old man admitted that his mistake was that he wanted to measure the world that was created by the goddess by his own standards. The main character, hearing this, asked if those who served the goddess really had such feelings. Sir Vague began to assure that the boy would feel the same as he did if he believed in Saint Karuna. Then the old man began to agitate his acquaintance and say that the doors of Keruvim were always open for him, but Zeke Moore was not enthusiastic and therefore refused. After this, our hero's journey continued. After a few minutes of silence, the elderly man turned to the guy again because he wanted to ask him something. The old man asked if the northern division of Belid was really here, because he still couldn't believe that the main character could really have such valuable information. Besides, this area didn't seem quite suitable for them, because Bela, whom the Belids believed in, was the god of water. The elderly man also heard that where they were building the temple, there had to be water. However, this was an arid desert. Zeke Moore understood that at first glance everything looked unrealistic, but the guy insisted that it was precisely because of this prejudice that people still could not find these guys. Sir Vague, hearing this, felt that these words really did make sense. Suddenly, the main characters on horseback quickly rushed forward, overtaking the old man. After that, he turned back, and with a satisfied grin said that they had to go a little further. Some time passed, our heroes left their horses in the shade and decided to continue on foot. Zeke Moore walked ahead as if he knew exactly where they should go, and Sir Vague obediently followed behind him, marveling at what surrounded him. Suddenly, the main character stopped as if he had lost the trail and did not know where they should go next. However, this was not the case at all. The guy led Sir Vague to a sharp cliff and declared that this was exactly the entrance they needed. After this, our heroes quickly went down where it was already completely dark, so there was no way to get by without a flashlight. Zeke Moore continued to confidently walk forward, leading Sir Vague behind him in order to prove to him that he was right. Soon the elderly man's face was distorted in genuine surprise at what he saw in front of him. Our heroes reached a huge underground lake, the crystal clear water of which reflected the bright sunlight from the surface. The old man could not even suspect that in such a wilderness there could be an underground lake of such scale. Now he understood why he still could not find the people from Belid. Suddenly our heroes saw a bright light far ahead of them, which was clearly artificially created by someone. Fearing that it might be their enemies, Zeke Moore and Sir Vague quickly hid behind the rocks so as not to reveal their presence here. After that, they began to closely observe what was happening in order to understand who was there besides them and what they were doing. It turned out that this bright light was emitted by torches that were burning nearby and illuminating the space around some building. This building was a temple into which large doors were introduced. The building was decorated with a mysterious sign carved in stone. Sir Vague, seeing it, immediately understood that it was the sign of Belid, which meant that the main character was right and people really did build a temple in such a place. Pleased with himself, Zeke Moore turned to the old man and asked if he now trusted him. In response to this, the elderly man suddenly grabbed the protagonist's hand, unable to contain his emotions. After this, he enthusiastically promised the boy that the best troops of Karuviman would be prepared to fight their common enemy. After some time, our heroes returned to the temple to tell everything they saw and move on to the next stage. They were received by an elderly man who sat at the head of the table, which spoke of his high status in this place. It was the Holy Father Karuvimana who, smiling kindly, said that he was very glad to meet our heroes. Zeke Moore just smiled at this, as if he had seen this old man before. Then the main character began to feel awkward because he remembered something from his past. In the days when the boy was a great demon lord, he did not know that one day he would be so close to the one who created the zombies with whom he fought. At that time, the Holy Father, remaining behind, healed his subordinates and even provided support in the attack, thanks to which the knights really had success. The main character admitted that because of this old man, he almost died in that battle. That is why the boy could not expect that one day he would meet with the Holy Father Karuvimana, which for him was even more difficult than meeting with the emperor of the country. These thoughts were interrupted by an elderly man who turned to the main character to talk to him. As a representative of Karuviman, he expressed his gratitude to the boy for telling them about the Belid hideout. The protagonist replied that he only extended a helping hand because he wanted to do something. The Holy Father had already heard that Zeke Moore wanted to take revenge on the Bellids for the death of an innocent child, so he was interested in whether the boy would fight against them on the side of Karuviman. The protagonist answered affirmatively, but added that according to his plan, while his comrades would attack the Bellid temple, he would try to get inside it alone. Hearing this, the Holy Father assumed that the guy intended to do this in order to deal with the person who killed the child. Zeke Moore took his time with his answer, as if collecting his thoughts while the older man humbly waited for him. The next moment, Zeke Moore, smiling slyly and with a sinister voice, declared that he planned to torture Kalun Trislov properly before his death. The Holy Father thought that the guy really did look scary now, which is why, at his old age, her heart could very well give out. Zeke Moore apologized for giving in to his feelings. The Holy Father understood the feelings of the main character because Kalun Trislova was indeed disgusting, but one should not forget that he was also very strong. The old man then said that there was a guess that Kalun Trislova was endowed with the same level of power as the high-ranking fighters of the Karuviman squad. That's why the old man asked the main character in all seriousness if everything would be okay if he entered into battle with him. To this, Zeke Moore, with the same seriousness, briefly replied that he would not interfere with the knights from Karuviman squads. Hearing this, the Holy Father understood that the guy was not going to change his goal and thought that this was even good. After this, the old man declared that this operation would be carried out in complete secrecy, since it was impossible for the enemy to find out about their plans and escape. That is why Sir Vague thought that it would be better for our three heroes to remain in the temple until the departure. The Holy Father agreed with this opinion. Unexpectedly, the main character turned to the elderly man, because he still had questions for him. Zeke Moore asked if he could ask the Holy Father for one more request. The old man did not refuse and began to listen attentively to the guy. The next moment, the main character put his hand on his chest, thus showing respect, and declared that he would like to receive the title of honorary knight. Sir Vague and Ina Luvella were very surprised to hear this, because they could not have expected that the guy's request would be exactly like this. The Holy Father immediately asked why Zeke Moore was so eager to receive this title. The main character began to say that he did not have any special reason for this. The guy simply believed that if he received the same rights as the elite knights, it would anger Kalun Trislov even more, which was only to his advantage. After some time, evening came. Our heroes went to rest, and now the Holy Father could talk with his subordinates in private. Sir Vague is confident that the main character was even more unique than it might seem at first glance. The old man admitted that Zeke Mora might have had a slightly strange character, but he knew his business well. Ina Luvella was sure that they would not be ashamed if the boy became an honorary knight of Karuviman. The Holy Father nevertheless listened to the words of his subordinates and decided to give the main character the title of elite knight. Suddenly, the elderly man remembered something and decided to discuss it immediately. He remembered that among the elite knights there was one active and strong guy whose skills resembled Zeke Mora. The Holy Father wondered if he could send this man on a mission with Sir Vague. The old man immediately asked who this guy was. The elderly man couldn't immediately remember his name, but still answered that his name was Glenn Zenard. Ina Luvella was surprised that the conversation turned to Lord Zenard and did not seem at all happy about it. The Holy Father noticed the girl's reaction and asked if something was wrong. Ina Luvella began to deny this, but said that every time he saw her, he constantly asked if she had any worries, although she always said that she had not. Sir Vague immediately began to laugh loudly, because he assumed that Lord Zenard was simply showing interest in the girl. Ina Luvella explained that as a servant of Karuna, she did not intend to start a relationship or get married. After this, Sir Vague told the Holy Father that Lord Zenard would not be able to participate in this war because he had gone as support somewhere else, and it was difficult to contact him. Ina Luvella didn't seem to be upset about this at all, but she still felt uncomfortable remembering Lord Zenard. Sir Vague noticed this and said that if the girl was uncomfortable, he could talk to the guy so that he would not bother her anymore. Ina asked not to do this because everything was fine. Then the elderly man asked if there was anything else that was bothering the girl. Ina timidly replied that in her opinion, the Lord was not just showing interest in her for no reason. She didn't know what the specific matter was, but she believed that there was something else behind it. Sir Vague was surprised by this, but didn't understand what the girl meant. Ina Luvella herself found it difficult to understand all this, but she thought about how to formulate her thoughts correctly. Still, she said that she had the feeling that Glenn Zenard was testing her. After some time, the squads of the Knights of Karuna were already crossing the desert in order to get to the right place. At the head of the column walked Sir Vague, leading the troops behind him. All our heroes were also here to take part in the battle. Along with this, Priests rode in the carts and said prayers for the protection of the soldiers and the successful conduct of the battle. Suddenly, one of the horses stopped because its owner had already arrived where he needed to. Servaig, who was very serious about the upcoming battle, signaled to the others to get some, and they also stopped. Our heroes looked at the entrance to the dungeons, realizing that this was exactly the place they needed. Aina Louvel was already eager to join the battle against the heretics. Servaig fully supported her in this. The elderly man, frowning with anger, called on everyone to hold a trial over these damn Bellids. Zeke Moore was not so enthusiastic, because he came here for a completely different purpose, but he saw that the other knights were literally burning with rage. Still, the main character got off his horse and, approaching the cliff, said that he would go there first. Servaig immediately realized that the boy had not changed his mind about getting inside the temple alone. Zeke Moore reminded him that the old man had long ago agreed with his idea. Ina Lavella seemed to want to object to this, but she didn't have time to say anything because she was interrupted. The main character asked the girl not to worry, because even if he was caught, he had almost no information. To this, Ina Lavella said that she did not mean this at all. Zeke Moore knew what the girl was worried about, so he began to assure her that the Bellids would not catch him, and nothing like that would happen. The guy also turned to his students and said that he had a request for them. He reminded them that they were trained to protect themselves, so they should not have died here. Then the main character added that since the guys were going to die, nothing could be done about it. The ease with which this was said amazed Hans and Sloka. After that, Zeke Moore began to quickly descend into the dungeon so as not to waste time and not worry at all about what he might encounter on the way. The others also began preparing for the descent. Ina Luvella was worried about the upcoming event and asked if everything would really be okay. Servaig decided that for now, it would be best for them to simply trust Zeke Moore. After waiting for some time, the elderly man decided that it was now their turn to go down into the dungeon to engage in battle with the heretics. No one present opposed this decision. Very soon, unrest began in the dungeon among the Bellids. A state of emergency was declared. It was connected with the fact that the Knights of Karuviman attacked their temple and were already on the other side of the lake. All the Bellids rushed there in order to retreat with the uninvited guests into battle. The fearless squads of knights, having heard the order of Servaig, have already begun to cross the river with the intention of getting rid of the heretics. However, not all of the Bellids understood what was happening. One of them looked in surprise at how his comrades were screaming and running somewhere. The young guy began to wonder what could have happened to cause everyone to be so alarmed. At that moment, someone's hand suddenly emerged from the darkness and headed straight towards the unsuspecting guy. He didn't have time to do anything or even call for help. All that could be heard were the sounds of drops of water hitting the floor and dripping from the unknown man's clothes. A moment later, the first enemy was already neutralized, and now nothing prevented the uninvited guest from moving further. Zeke Moore looked at his defeated opponent and thought that nothing had changed in this temple. On the way here, the guy was worried that the layout might have changed compared to what it was before his rebirth, but everything remained exactly the same. The main character was alone, so he managed to swim underwater unnoticed, but he was worried whether the Knights of Karuviman would be able to cope without his help. Still, Zeke Moore decided not to think about unnecessary things and focus on what he had to do. The guy approached the door with the thought that there was a prayer room here, and since this was a temple, there had to be something very important here. The main character swung the doors open with a sharp movement and saw in front of him a spacious room that played an important role for the Bellids. Zeke Moore was very surprised when he saw what was in this prayer room. The guy looked at a small pyramid that emitted a bright light and was painted with mysterious hieroglyphs. He could not believe that it was created in such a place. Then the main character thought that if this artifact was here, then Trislova would obviously run here first, because for the Bellids this would be a higher priority than stopping the Knights of Karuviman. Thanks to these thoughts, Zeke Moore came up with a cunning plan that made him smile. Still, the guy thought, why shouldn't he wait for his victim here in that case? Meanwhile, outside the Balid temple, a fierce battle was taking place, which was even accompanied by explosions. Well armored, the Knights of Karuviman mercilessly killed their opponents, leaving them no chance of salvation. One of the Ballids ran up to his master, and in an excited voice informed him that their enemies were crossing the lake. Kolin Trislova, hearing this, immediately asked how many people were in the detachment of their enemies. The subordinate was not sure, but it seemed that there were more than 1,000 soldiers there. Trislova thought that if there were about 1,000 Knights of Karuviman, then they still had a chance, because now there were about the same number of followers of Belid in the temple. However, the man was still worried because there was still one problem left. He then asked whether their enemies were all either knights or persons of high rank. Subordinate, I will assume that this is exactly how it was. Kaluna Trislov was very angry at this information, which is why he hit the stone hard with his fist. He did not understand how Karuviman could have found out about this place. The man kept thinking that this was not a force that this unit could handle. And besides, it was already too late to call for reinforcements. Nevertheless, he made a decision and, turning to the Tremble brothers, ordered them to lead the troops into battle and not allow Karuviman's people to cross the lake. Hearing this, the subordinate immediately ordered the soldiers to take their places and hold back the knights so that they would not cross the lake. At this moment, Kalun Trislova became even more alarmed because he remembered that he still had one very important matter to do. The man began to quickly run back to the temple, thinking that he first needed to deal with this particular matter. Kalun Trislova quickly walked along the empty corridors of the temple, calming himself along the way. The husband thought that as soon as he sorted out this matter, he would be able to ask God for Bella's blessing for victory, and then everything would be fine. Kalun Trislova entered the prayer room but stopped abruptly in surprise when he saw what was happening there. On the floor lay several lifeless bodies of the servants of this temple, and everything around was stained with blood. The culprit of this was calmly sitting right in the center of the hall because he was waiting for someone. Despite this, Kalun Trislov was more alarmed by the fact that the magical artifact for which he had come here was not in its usual place. The man turned to the stranger with displeasure and asked who he was and what he was doing there, assuming that he was one of Karuviman's knights. Zeke Moore immediately began to deny this and explained that he was a man who had a bad feeling about the man. These words made Kalun Trislov even more angry, and so he decided to immediately teach the impudent, uninvited guest a lesson. Suddenly, the protagonist asked if the man's name was Kalun Trislova and if he was the cardinal of the Belid clan. This made the man momentarily dumbfounded. Zeke Moore looked at his enemy with an evil gaze and smiled slyly, making it clear that he already knew the answer to the question posed. Zeke Moore looked at his enemy with an evil look and smiled slyly, asking if he really was the one who killed the innocent child. Kalun Trislova was surprised by this, because she really didn't understand what kind of child they were talking about. Then the man got angry because he thought that the main character had burst in here on a whim and was talking some nonsense. After that, he asked with displeasure whether he really had to remember every little thing he had ever done. It was clear that Zeke Moore did not like these words. Suddenly, someone's footsteps were heard in the corridor. It turned out that a whole group of people were hurrying to the prayer room. It would be the Belids who came to the aid of their master, Kalun Trislova, who had already ordered them to deal with the uninvited guest. This did not frighten Zeke Moore at all. He began to slowly rise from his seat, saying along the way that he would like to hear the reason first. Kalun Trislova still did not understand what the main character was telling him, and therefore could not talk about any reasons. Zeke Moore reminded the man that it was he who killed people in the slums and at the same time tortured a child. After hearing this, a crazy smile appeared on Kalun Trislov's face because he finally understood what kind of child the main character was talking about. The man confirmed that it was he who killed him. He then went on to say that he had come to the village simply to buy provisions, but it was at that moment that their paths crossed. The man saw the boy and made a decision that he soon put into practice. Kalun Trislova smiled widely without any embarrassment when he recalled that at that moment he decided to kill everyone. The man continued to say that the murder of the child's family and his neighbors was nothing more than a bonus. Zeke Moore humbly listened to everything from beginning to end. Then Kalun Trislova said that the reason for his actions was the child himself. Everyone died precisely because of him. They all died at the hands of the one who carried the honor of Bella and controlled this world. Kalun Trislova truly believed that these people were thus awarded a great honor. The main character, listening to all this, remained absolutely cold and completely controlled his emotions, although it was probably hard for him. Still, the guy asked if that was really why Kalun Trislov blamed that child for what happened. The man continued to smile broadly and tell him that he wanted to teach him one last thing, something called responsibility. The main character didn't respond to this and only looked away dismissively, thus showing that he considered the man's words nonsense. Suddenly, Kalun Trislova heard an explosion, after which he considered that he no longer had time to postpone the fight. He was also worried about how the people of Karuviman knew about this place. Zeke Moore honestly admitted that he was the reason for this. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and could not believe the truth of these words. Then the main character, with a satisfied smile on his face, repeated once again that it was he who called the knights of Karuviman here. The guy then explained that he did this in order to finish off Colin Trislov. These words shocked the man, causing him to lose his power of speech for a moment. However, the cardinal of the Belid clan thought that these words were nonsense and asked what the protagonist could have done to finish him off. Zeke Moore said with regret that she really cared about that child, and the men killed him so mercilessly. So now he was ready for anything. Colin Trislova was struck by these words and did not believe that the main character had made all this noise because of that boy. Then the guy recalled the words of the cardinal, who recently said that it was only because of the boy that he killed him and the rest of the people. The main character then suggested that they would not have met if he had sat like a quiet mouse in a dark place. However, Zeke Moore was here, which means that this crumbling old temple with the fish head will completely disappear today. These words greatly angered Colin Trislov, who seemed about to launch an attack. Suddenly, an explosion occurred behind the man, which shocked his subordinates and himself. This indicated that the Knights of Karuvaman were already close. Zeke Moore, with a smile on his face, continued to say that everything that would happen today in this temple would be solely due to the fault of Colin Trislov. The man may have understood that the guy was right, but this did not calm him down in any way, but on the contrary, made him even more angry. The next moment, the cardinal of the Belid clan used his abilities to send a rapid stream of water straight at the protagonist. This attack was quickly approaching Zeke Moore, who was unable to repel it. The guy suddenly jumped high up, thinking that the force was enormous and he could even die from one such blow. Suddenly, the main character grabbed onto something with his hand in order to no longer go down to the floor and stay away from your opponent's attacks. It turned out that Zeke Moore had caught on a bonehead that served as a decoration for the prayer hall. Here at the heights, he breathed a sigh of relief. Colin Trislov was surprised not only that his opponent was able to dodge his attack, but also that he climbed so high for no reason. The main character then said that he really wouldn't mind if a man became the one who taught that boy responsibility. However, the guy was sure that the fish head that the Belids worshipped taught them all only that there was no need to bear responsibility. Colin Trislov was very angry that Zeke Moore insulted his god and his faith. This anger resulted in a huge stream of water, with which the man again intended to attack his opponent. The main character, like last time, could not repel such a strong attack, so he quickly jumped to the side in order to save his life. The guy still wasn't going to come down to the ground, so he grabbed onto a small ledge on the wall and stayed there. Despite the danger of the situation, Zeke Moore smiled as if everything was going exactly as he'd planned. At the same time, Colin Trislova was unhappy and very nervous. He took it out on his subordinates and ordered them to attack the guy. They just stood there. The cardinal's subordinates immediately began to carry out his order and therefore threw their throwing knives at the main character. In order to defend himself from this attack, Zeke Moore had to draw his sword this time. The next moment, the guy began to quickly swing his weapon in order to deflect one knife after another. Colin Trislova and his subordinates looked on in surprise as their next attack was again unsuccessful. Throwing knives fell to the floor, simultaneously making a ringing sound of metal. Then Zeke Moore put his sword back in its sheath and asked the cardinal of the Belid clan not to get so excited. Suddenly, the main character showed that same magical artifact and asked what would happen to it if the man's attack hit it. Colin Trislova was very unhappy that the guy dared to take this thing, even though he didn't know what it was intended for. In fact, the man was wrong. Zeke Moore knew that it was a magical artifact that controlled monsters. It was also called the vengeful spirit of the pyramid. Colin Trislova was very surprised to hear this, and immediately asked how the guy could know about this. Zeke Moore looked at the artifact and thought about how it allowed him to manipulate any monsters. The vengeful spirit itself was a sinister thing, and to complement it, negative emotions emanating from an innocent soul were necessary. Even before the revival of the main character, the Belids used cruel methods to obtain these emotions in order to complete the artifact. Colin Trislova tortured that boy just so that the artifact would become complete. The frequent appearance of monsters in the village also occurred because of the vengeful spirit of the pyramid that Trislova brought with him, because the monsters instinctively followed him. Zeke Moore replied that he knew a lot about this artifact and threatened that if something went wrong, he would definitely destroy what the Belid clan protected so strongly. Colin Trislova only smirked at this because he knew that the vengeful spirit of the pyramid was not so easy to break, which could not be said about the guy's weak body. That is why the man decided to kill the main character in the most brutal way in the world, and for this again. The next moment, Trislov's Colin directed a rapid stream of water at the protagonist, which he again had to dodge. Despite this, the stream of water continued to pursue the guy, so for some time he still had to run away. Colin Trislova was pleased with this and asked with a smile how much longer Zikmore was going to run away. At this time, the main character thought that he could somehow deal with everyone else, but he would not be able to defeat Colin Trislov in his current state. So the guy said that the difference in their strength was too obvious, and insisting on a one-on-one duel on his part was somehow stupid. Instead, he planned to run away first. Colin Trislova only laughed at this, because he believed that his opponent had nowhere to run from here. However, the main character had a different opinion. He felt that the brick he was holding on to right now was not quite securely fastened. Zeke Moore was very pleased to find this, because it was exactly what he was looking for. Then the guy began to quickly dismantle the wall, carelessly throwing the debris to the sides. Colin Trislova watched all this and only laughed, believing that this was only a desperate attempt by his opponent to save himself, which would not bring any results. Suddenly, the man's expression changed dramatically because he realized that everything was not so clear-cut. The main character, having dismantled the wall, managed to discover some narrow passage at the end of which only darkness was visible. This was exactly what the guy needed right now, so he immediately decided to take advantage of his opportunity to escape. Finally, the main character mocked Kolun Trislov, who was angry and called him a vile, cowardly mouse. After some time, Zeke Moore was already in the underground prison of the Northern Division of Belid. The guy, being very pleased with himself, carefreely twirled a bunch of keys on his finger and didn't worry about anything. Zeke Moore passed through his room, which contained entrances to numerous chambers. People who were sitting behind bars also noticed this. The main character, with a smile on his face, turned to all the prisoners and asked if they wanted revenge. Meanwhile, outside the temple, fierce fighting continued as the Belids desperately tried to stop the advance of the Karuviman Knights. The commanders loudly ordered their subordinates not to be afraid and to fight to the end. In order to prevent the knights from advancing even closer to the temple, the Belids had to use their skills. Suddenly, from the lake that was next to the temple, several rapid streams of water arose, which could not help but shock the knights of Karuviman. Sir Vague, who watched everything that was happening from the side in order to more effectively command the troops, also videoed the use of this skill. The monks who arrived with the soldiers prayed fervently to Saint Karuna to protect her faithful servants. The prayers were not in vain. A moment later, a huge cross appeared in the air, consisting of energy, which entered into confrontation with the flow of water. At this point, Sir Wagand was approached by his subordinates and informed that all soldiers sent to the Belids were under attack. The old man was not happy with this news, and so he took a firmer grip on his sword to fix it. He held the sword in front of him and began to concentrate his mana in order to use his skills. A moment later, everything was ready, as evidenced by the old man's determined gaze and his frowning eyebrows. After this, Sir Vague jumped high into the air while swinging his sword and releasing a stream of energy towards the temple. The next moment, a huge explosion was heard, which would surely cause serious damage to the Belids. It turned out that the barrier that protected the temple from just such attacks was able to withstand, although it was covered with minor cracks. The old man found it hard to believe that his strongest attack was useless because the shield was stronger than he thought. Suddenly, the old man's subordinate turned to him again and reported that they had just destroyed a wall of Belid troops near the lake. This was a chance for the Knights of Karuviman to set up the equipment they had prepared for the crossing, but it had to be done as quickly as possible before the enemies gathered their strength. In addition to military skills, the Knights also had engineering skills, so they acted quickly and in a coordinated manner. To begin with, the required number of supports were secured. After this, the soldiers quickly launched several rafts made of logs that were tied together with a strong iron chain. A few minutes later, the knights reported that the bridge for crossing the lake was already ready. Hearing this, Sir Vague loudly ordered all his subordinates to immediately go on the attack and destroy the heretics. Everyone obeyed this order as one. The Belids, seeing that their enemies were crossing the lake, immediately headed to the shore to prevent them from advancing closer to the temple. Behind the soldiers were mages who emanated ominous energy. They also played an important role in this battle. These magicians were able to skillfully control the flow of water, which was quite advantageous considering that they were in the reservoir very close by. This made it difficult for the Karuviman Knights to cross the bridge, as they were attacked by the water itself. Someone noticed that the strength of the barrier that protected the temple had become even stronger, and therefore Ina Luvella had to be very careful. The girl, although standing behind, also performed important work. She prayed to Saint Karuna to grant strength and blessings to her faithful servants. Meanwhile, Sir Vague got tired of leading the soldiers from afar, so he decided to move into the thick of the battle. The elderly man ran quickly across the bridge over the lake, setting an example for the young knights. Along the way, he decided to help his subordinates deal with the enemy, and for this purpose, he had already concentrated the required amount of energy in his weapon. The next moment, Sir Vague made a sharp swing of his sword and sent a stream of energy towards the Ballad Temple. This attack instantly destroyed several Ballad mages who were hindering the advancement of the Karuvaman knights across the bridge. However, the old man still had to somehow get rid of the magical barrier that protected the temple, as well as the ominous energy that hovered around. Sir Vague believed that if he attracted this energy to himself, the other knights would not be distracted by it. It would still not harm the old man in any way, but it would more than help the soldiers. After this, the old man looked ahead and saw that the Bellads were still fighting fiercely to prevent the knights of Karuviman from crossing the bridge. Sir Vague felt that they were still at a disadvantage, and that this needed to be changed urgently. The old man suggested that if the shield was destroyed and they were able to damage the main military camp, the advantage would shift to their side. That was why the old man was now thinking about Zeke Moore, who was just inside the temple. Sir Vague really hoped that the main character would be able to destroy the protective barrier from the inside. At this time, there was indeed a commotion inside the temple. Soldiers quickly ran along the corridors and checked every room. Kalun Trislova ordered his subordinates to check everything properly because, among other things, the main character stole the artifact, the vengeful spirit of the pyramid. The soldiers obeyed the orders of the clan's cardinal and did not bypass any room. However, despite their efforts, the main character was nowhere to be found. Soon, one of his subordinates approached Colin Trislov and reported that they had already searched all possible places, but the guy was nowhere to be seen. The man was very unhappy to hear this, and was angry while thinking about how Zeke Moore could have found out about the secret tunnel that even they themselves did not suspect. The soldier then suggested that the main character was constantly moving around, avoiding their gaze, and that was why they could not find him. These words made Colin Trislov even more angry, which is why he could no longer contain his emotions. The next moment, the man kicked the soldier in the chest with all his might, calling him an idiot as he was very unhappy with his work. The cardiologist loudly repeated that Zeke Moore was carrying around an artifact called the Vengeful Spirit of the Pyramid, which was very important to the Ballads. It seemed that the cardinal was most worried about this artifact and not about the battle that was taking place outside the temple. The soldier, trying to cope with the pain, asked the man for forgiveness and promised that they would check everything again. After this, the subordinate quickly ran off to carry out his task so as not to further anger the clan cardinal and not to test his patience. After this, Colin Trislova calmed down a little because he needed time to think about everything. The man remembered that according to Zeke Moore himself, it was he who brought Karuviman here in order to take revenge on him, which meant that the guy had to help the knights in the battle. The main character then confidently said that today, the temple would completely disappear, so one could assume that he had thought everything through in advance. In addition, the cardinal suggested that, judging by the guy's reaction to the vengeful spirit of the pyramid, he had not come here for this holy relic from the very beginning. That is why Colin Trislov was interested in what the main character was doing in the temple. Suddenly, the man had some thought that stunned him for a moment. At this time, not all Ballads were fighting on the battlefield. Some of them were inside the country and sat with their heads bowed near the statue of the deity Belu. They were all completely concentrated and recited prayers without stopping, simultaneously emitting an ominous aura. Thanks to this, the very same magical barrier around the temple maintained its shape and strength. It was at this moment that someone else quietly entered the room. It was Zeke Moore who began to examine the room in order to understand whether he had entered the right door. Suddenly he saw knights here who, as he thought, should not be here. Another moment later, Zeke Moore felt the presence of Kalun Trislov behind him, who was smiling slyly, already rejoicing in his victory. Zeke Moore began to turn back sharply to avoid the man's attack, but it was too late. Trislov's Colin had already concentrated energy in his left hand and was ready to strike. The next moment, the main character fell to his knees and his blood began to drip onto the floor. Zeke Moore was badly wounded, causing him to experience terrible pain and unable to even stand on his feet. The cardinal was glad to see this, which made him smile widely, while the main hero thought that this was about to happen. The man ordered his subordinates to grab the guy and, believing that his wound was fatal, said that he would no longer be able to run far. Nevertheless, the main character still jumped up and ran out of the room. Colin Trislova demanded that his subordinates first take the shrine from Zeke Moore when they caught him. After this, the cardinal of the Bellad clan also left the room in order to pursue the protagonist. He closed the door behind him so that no one would disturb the magicians anymore and distract them from their vital work. A moment later, the door opened again. The visitor's bare feet indicated that he was not one of the Bellads. The mysterious man saw those same magicians who did not pay any attention to his appearance and remembered that he came exactly where he needed to. Then in the underground prison, Zeke Moore addressed the captives of the Belid clan and said that he would give them a chance. He wanted to give the people who were supposed to be sacrificed to the deity Belu a chance to take revenge. Now these people armed with knives intended to take full advantage of their chance. At this time, Kolun Trislova walked carefree along the corridor and laughed because he had managed to catch up with the main character again. The wounded Zeke Moore's strength was leaving him, so he could not run for long, and his body needed rest. Kolun Trislova turned to the guy and asked if that was all, and he would no longer run away like a rat. The main character did not respond to this and only looked angrily at the villain, whom he still intended to avenge for the death of an innocent child. At the same time, Kolun Trislova opened his mouth in a wide smile and looked at the main character with a crazy look, confidently declaring that the guy's life was now over. This moment of jubilation was suddenly interrupted by a strong shaking of the temple building, which only caused questions in the cardinal. The man did not understand at all what was happening. At the same time, Zeke Moore already knew that his plan had worked, and this made him smile. Meanwhile, fierce fighting continued near the temple, with the Belids desperately trying to stop the advance of the Karuviman knights. Hans was also there, who, together with the others, fought bravely against the Belid soldiers. The guy, despite his young age, fought with experienced knights on equal terms, skillfully dodging their attacks. He noticed in time that the iron armor did not completely cover his opponent's body, and this could be taken advantage of. The next moment, Hans, who was determined, made a sharp swing with his sword. As expected, the guy was able to hit the vulnerable spot, thus severely wounding his opponent, after which he could no longer continue to fight. Hans did not stop there, because the battle was still going on and the goals had not been achieved. The guy quickly attacked another enemy who was sneaking up from behind, while thinking about how his body was moving practically on its own. Having eliminated another enemy, the guy admitted that Zeke Moore's training was truly effective. Meanwhile, the bullet commander ordered a group of his subordinates to quickly move to another position and stop Karuviman's advance. However, the soldiers were not destined to carry out this order, because the ground beneath their feet suddenly began to shake as if from an earthquake. Soon an obstacle of stones appeared on the knights' path, preventing them from going any further. The bullet soldiers began to get nervous because they did not understand what it was and how to deal with it. Looking to the side, they saw one of their opponents who was enveloped in a glowing protective barrier. Inside the barrier was Slock, who, like everyone else, took part in the battle, but used his magical abilities instead of weapons. The guy was completely focused because he believed that if he could destroy the path, they would be able to take control of everything. However, Slock was afraid that because of his magic, the cave in which the battle took place would collapse, and then Zeke Moore would definitely punish him. The guy's thoughts were interrupted by a strange loud sound that immediately attracted his attention. Hans also heard it, as did everyone who was fighting near the temple. No one understood what was the reason for the sudden appearance of this sound. Looking at the temple, everyone saw that the magical barrier that protected it began to blur and gradually disappear. Soon there was no trace left of him, and the ominous energy began to evaporate. The bullet soldiers were shocked that their protective barrier had disappeared and could not simply believe it. Sir Vague, who also saw this, immediately assumed that it was the work of Zeke Moore who succeeded. Then the old man raised his sword high up and loudly declared that it was time to destroy everything so that the magical barrier would not be restored again. After this, the old man ordered the destruction of the bullet lair. Hearing this, the monks began to concentrate their energy, simultaneously asking Saint Karuna to take measures of sacred punishment against her enemies. The next moment, the building of the Ballad Temple was attacked by several powerful energy charges at once, which easily broke through the stone walls. At this time, the temple was also in turmoil. Each attack was accompanied by shaking of the walls and the risk of their collapse. Kolun Trislova noted that these tremors could not be compared with the last time, because now the temple seemed to be shaking on its own. The man did not understand what could be the reason for this. Suddenly, the main character began to calm the man down, saying that there was nothing special here, so there was no need to worry. The surprised Kolun Trislova immediately turned his gaze to the guy. Zeke Moore continued to say that the barrier that protected this building had disappeared, and therefore the Knights of Karaviman could now attack the temple without hindrance. These words shocked the man. He could not believe that the main characters were now really telling him the truth. Zeke Moore, who felt fine despite his injuries, explained that while he was attracting attention to himself, his new acquaintances took care to remove the barrier. Kolun Trislova nervously began to ask if there was really someone else who had secretly made his way into the temple. The protagonist answered that only he had made his way here, but there were other people here who were also on his side. The guy then tapped his foot on the floor and explained that he meant the people who were imprisoned underground. It was precisely those people whom Kalun Trislova captured in order to sacrifice to the deity Bel, who helped Zikmor carry out his plans. The cardinal of the Belid clan could not believe it and was shocked that their brothers who stood to protect the barrier died at the hands of those victims. Zikmor was amused by the fact that the man still couldn't admit his defeat, so he thought of something. The next moment, the guy suddenly jumped up and ran down the corridor, asking Kalun Trislov to catch up with him so he could see for himself. The cardinal had no intention of running after his opponent, but instead decided to use his abilities, for which he had already concentrated energy in his hand, and took aim. The man fired a destructive energy and almost hit Zikmor, but he managed to jump aside in time. After the attack, a huge hole remained on the stone wall, which indicated that the main character had not dodged Kalun Trislov's attacks in vain. Seeing this, Zikmor began to smile because the events that were happening were captivating his spirit and adding excitement. Meanwhile, the cardinal had already ordered his subordinates to immediately set out in pursuit of the main character. The man himself intended to continue attacking the guy with his abilities, being confident that he would not be able to dodge it for long. This time, Kalun Trislova sent 3 energy charges towards Zikmor, which quickly approached him. The main character has not yet taken any action to save himself. I hope that he will have time to run to the door. Even without this, all the charges missed and hit the walls, causing even more damage to the temple from the inside. At the same time, Zikmor had already run to the door and broke it down with his foot to save time and ran inside the spacious room. Kalun Trislova was very unhappy that the guy entered the ritual room and ordered only the highest-ranking subordinates to quickly follow him. The man ordered the rest of the soldiers to stay near the entrance and guard it, so that the main character could not escape again. After this, Kalun Trislova slowly headed towards the room for the ritual, because he understood that his opponent had nowhere else to run. The man walked into the room with a wide smile on his face because he thought he had cornered the rat. Suddenly the smile disappeared from the cardinal's face because he saw the terrifying picture that was in the room. On the floor near the statue of the deity Belu lay many bloody bodies of those magicians who were supposed to maintain the protective barrier around the temple, and an ominous atmosphere hung around. Kalun Trislova was shocked by this sight and did not understand how this could happen. Unexpectedly, Zikmor came out from behind the statues and with a sly smile on his face, asked if the great Cardinal Bell liked what he now saw in front of him. The angry man immediately asked the guy where the people who had committed this massacre were. Zikmor was in no hurry to answer because he didn't want to set up his new acquaintances. In fact, the people who helped the main character have long since left through the secret passage that he told them about. Kalun Trislova was very angry and asked what Zikmor was trying to achieve. The guy was surprised that his opponent still did not understand why he was doing all this. Then the main character advised the man to try asking the one who was watching everything here about his motives. Of course, the guy was already referring to the statue of the divine Bell, which he dismissively called a fish head. Kalun Trislov was very angry about this, and he demanded that Zikmor not dare to address the great Bell in this way. It seemed that the main character listened to his enemy, and this time very loudly addressed the deity in an appropriate manner. The guy said that the great Belu himself saw all this brutality, and that is why he asked to say, because of whom all this horror happened. After this, the main character cleared his throat a little in order to prepare his vocal cords, because now he had to put on a show and speak in a voice that was not his own. Unnoticed by the cardinal, Zikmor quickly hid behind the statue of the deity Belu. Kalun Trislova, I don't understand what the main character was doing at all. Suddenly, a very rough and ominous voice was heard in the ritual room. This voice said that everything that happened in the temple happened because of Cardinal Kalun Trislov. The man heard this and was very scared. From the outside, it seemed that it was Belu who said that Kalun Trislova killed a boy in one of the villages, after which a young man came here to take revenge on him for this. The voice continued to say that it was because of this that such a terrible tragedy occurred in the temple. After this, the main character stuck his head out from behind the statue of the deity and with a satisfied grin on his face, asked if the man had heard what Bella had said. Kalun Trislova was absolutely shocked by what was happening and did not even know what he was supposed to do now, because he truly believed that this misfortune happened only because of his fault. Zikmor was very pleased with this result and added fuel to the fire by saying that according to the deity Belu, everything really happened due to the fault of a man.